Welcome in the journey of time. Tonight, we will unfold another page of history. Perhaps you're lying in bed, chilling and getting relaxed, or maybe you've simply decided to let the story accompany you for a while. Where are you joining me from tonight? Leave a comment if you like. I always enjoy hearing about your corner of the world. And what time is it for you now? If you find this slow and thoughtful stories of those who came before us brings you a sense of peace and comfort, I'd be honored if you subscribe. So, here's the story. The Unwanted Daughter. The wind howled across the steep, unforgiving slopes of Mount Parthenion, a bitter lament that mirrored the despair clinging to the crags and pine forests. On this day, the heart of King Iasus of Arcadia was colder than the mountain stone. He stood in his sun-warmed chamber within the palace at Tegea, its plastered walls painted with scenes of heroic hunts and fertile harvests, a world away from the wildness to which he would soon banish his own flesh and blood. His queen had labored for a day and a night, and the outcome was not the robust male heir he had demanded of the gods, but a daughter. The midwife, her hands still stained, presented the swaddled infant to the king. Her face was a mask of weary apprehension. "My lord," she whispered, her voice rough like grinding stones, "the queen is weak, but she lives. Your child is healthy." Iasus did not reach for the bundle. His eyes, dark and flinty, scanned the tiny red face. A daughter, a girl. In his mind, she was not a blessing, but a burden, a drain on his lineage, a political tool at best, and now a bitter disappointment. The desire for a son to carry his name, to wield his spear, to expand his kingdom, had been an all-consuming fire within him. This girl was a bucket of cold water upon the flames. "Take it," he commanded, his voice devoid of any warmth the afternoon sun provided. He turned his back, gazing out at the fertile plains of Arcadia that stretched toward the horizon. "Take it to the mountain. Leave it for the will of the gods. If they see fit to spare her, so be it, but she will not be a drain on this house." A gasp rippled through the attending women. To expose a child, especially a royal one, was a harsh and ancient practice, a sentence of death delivered not by a blade, but by the elements and the wild. The midwife's arms trembled, but she dared not disobey. She clutched the infant closer, feeling a tiny hand fist against her chest. The journey up the mountain was a silent, funereal procession. The midwife, accompanied by a single, grim-faced guardsman, climbed beyond the terraced farms and the pastures where sheep bells tinkled. The air grew thin and sharp. The lush greens of the valley gave way to the grays and deep greens of the high wilderness. They stopped in a clearing where a single, lightning-blasted oak stood as a skeletal sentinel. The ground was a carpet of fallen needles and sharp flints. With a heart heavier than any stone, the midwife laid the infant upon the bare earth, unwrapping the fine linen swaddling to leave her exposed. The baby, stirred by the sudden cold, let out a thin, mewling cry that was snatched away by the wind. The sound tore at the woman's soul. She made a quick, desperate prayer to Artemis, mistress of the wilds, and then turned, hurrying back down the path, the guardsman's steady footsteps behind her a grim counterpoint to the frantic beating of her own heart. The infant's cries grew stronger, fueled by hunger and the primal fear of abandonment. The sun dipped below the peaks, casting long, predatory shadows. The temperature plummeted. The world was a vast, terrifying expanse of sound and sensation, the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth, the hoot of an owl, the chilling howl of a wolf pack beginning its nightly chorus. It was this last sound that heralded her salvation. A she-bear, A massive creature whose coat was a shadow come to life emerged from the tree line. Her own cubs had been taken by hunters weeks before, and her teats ached with unsuckled milk. She was drawn by the strange, persistent sound, a noise unlike any she knew. She lumbered into the clearing, her great head swinging low, her warm breath pluming in the frigid air. She sniffed the tiny, wriggling form. The human scent was alien, but the scent of milk, motherhood, was a powerful, instinctual call. The bear, with a gentleness belying her immense strength, nuzzled the child. The baby, responding to the warmth and the soft fur, nuzzled back. The she-bear lay down, curling her great body around the infant, and allowed her to feed. The hungry cry ceased, replaced by the soft, contented sounds of suckling. Under the vast, star-strewn sky, nestled in the protective circle of the bear's warmth, the unwanted daughter of a king found her first mother and took her first step toward a legendary life. The Bear's Den. For 2 years, the seasons turned on Mount Parthenon. The infant, who had no name given to her by man, thrived in a manner no human could have conceived. Her world was not one of woven blankets and lullabies, but of coarse fur, the musky scent of the earth, and the raw sounds of the wilderness. Her first memories were not of a human face, but of the dark, intelligent eyes of the she-bear, and the feeling of immense security when pressed against the animal's heartbeat, a slow, powerful rhythm that drowned out the terrors of the night. She learned the language of the forest not with words, but with her body and senses. She learned to crawl on the damp, leafy loam of the forest floor, her small hands and knees growing tough and calloused. She learned which grubs were safe to eat when the bear dug them from rotten logs, their soft, wriggling bodies a source of protein. She learned to drink water from mountain streams by lowering her face to the surface, her reflection a wild, dirty thing next to the smooth, gray stones of the creek bed. The she-bear was a diligent, if unconventional, mother. She taught the girl cub lessons: how to scent the wind for danger, how to move with a silence that belied her size, how to distinguish between the harmless rustle of a badger and the threatening crack of a branch under a hunter's boot. The girl's first coherent sounds were not mother or father, but low grunts and playful growls that mimicked her ursine family. Her body grew strong and wiry. Her hair, a tangled mane of chestnut brown, was often matted with leaves and twigs. She was a creature of pure instinct, a hybrid of human potential and feral upbringing. Their den was a deep, dry cave hidden behind a curtain of thick ivy and thorny brambles. The entrance was narrow, requiring the girl to squeeze through a gap that kept larger predators at bay. Inside, the air was cool and carried the permanent, comforting smell of bare and dried herbs. The floor was littered with soft, dry ferns that the she-bear gathered and replaced with the changing seasons. In this earthen womb, the girl slept through the howling storms of winter and the humid nights of summer, safe in the embrace of her shaggy protector. One afternoon, when the sun dappled the forest floor in patterns of gold and green, their peace was shattered. The she-bear, her senses screaming a warning, rose to her full height, her nose twitching. The girl, now a toddler who could walk with a stumbling, determined gait, clung to the bear's leg, sensing the shift in the air. A group of hunters had stumbled upon their territory. They were not local Arcadians who knew to respect the old bear, but men from a distant land, their eyes gleaming with the prospect of a magnificent pelt. The lead hunter, a man with a bronze-tipped spear and a leopard skin across his shoulders, let out a triumphant shout. He saw only a prize, not a mother. The she-bear roared, a sound that shook the very trees, and charged. The world dissolved into a chaos of shouting men, the snarls of the bear, and the sharp, metallic scent of blood. The girl watched, hidden behind the trunk of a great oak, her small body trembling. She saw a spear find its mark in the bear's shoulder. She saw her mother swipe a massive paw, sending a hunter crashing into a tree with a sickening crunch. But the numbers were too great. Another spear, thrown with deadly accuracy, pierced the bear's side. The great beast staggered, her roar becoming a wet, guttural groan. She turned her head, her dark eyes finding the girl one last time, a final, profound look passing between them, a look of love, of warning, of farewell. Then she collapsed, her lifeblood soaking into the earth that had sustained her. The hunters cheered, closing in on their kill. In their triumph, they did not notice the small, feral child who burst from her hiding place, not with a cry, but with a snarl of pure, unadulterated rage. She launched herself at the nearest hunter, her tiny fingers clawing at his leg, her teeth sinking into his calf. The man yelled in surprise and pain, shaking her off like a bothersome insect. She fell hard, the wind knocked from her lungs. The hunters stared in stunned silence. Here was a human child, wilder than any wolf cub, glaring up at them with eyes that held the ancient fire of the wilderness itself. The man she had bitten looked down at the bleeding puncture marks on his leg, then back at the child. The thrill of the hunt evaporated, replaced by a superstitious dread. This was no ordinary girl. This was a child of the mountain, a nymph, a spirit, something not to be killed, but to be feared. Leaving the bear's carcass where it lay, they backed away, muttering prayers to avert ill fortune. They retreated down the mountain, their trophy forgotten, their hearts pounding with a fear far deeper than any a bear could inspire. Alone once more, the girl crawled to the body of her mother. She curled up against the still warm fur, her small body racked with silent sobs. The great heart that had been her lullaby was silent. The warmth was already beginning to fade. The forest, once a place of companionship and safety, had become vast, empty, and terribly lonely. The hunter's discovery. Silence descended upon the clearing, a silence more profound and terrifying than any noise the forest had ever produced. The vibrant chorus of birds and insects had been stifled by the violence, leaving behind a void filled only by the whisper of the wind through the pine needles, a sound comparable to the dying breath of the world. The girl lay pressed against the massive, still flank of the she-bear. The coarse fur, once a source of warmth and comfort, was now growing cold, its vitality seeping into the dark, thirsty soil beneath. The metallic tang of blood filled her nostrils, a scent that would forever be etched into her memory as the smell of loss. She did not understand death, not in any conceptual way known to civilized humans. Her understanding was primal, visceral. The great heart whose rhythm had been the drumbeat of her existence was still. The warm breath that had washed over her in sleep was gone. A deep, trembling coldness seeped from the bear's body into her own, a chill that had little to do with the mountain air. She made no sound. Her tears were not the dramatic sobs of a civilized child, but a silent, relentless stream that carved clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. Her small fingers clutched at the fur, holding on to the last physical remnant of her world. For a day and a night she remained there. The sun traversed the sky, its light failing to penetrate the cold hollow growing inside her. The moon rose, casting a silver, indifferent glow upon the tragic scene. Hunger and thirst eventually gnawed at her, their demands more insistent than grief. With a sluggishness that felt like moving through deep water, she pushed herself away from the bear. Her body felt heavy, alien. She looked at the carcass, her young mind trying to comprehend the finality. Then instinct took over. She needed to drink. She stumbled towards the familiar stream, her gait unsteady. The world around her, once a playground of scents and sounds, was now a landscape of threats. Every shadow seemed to hold a hunter. Every crack of a twig under her own feet made her flinch. She reached the stream and drank, the cold water a shock to her system. Her reflection stared back at her, a pair of wide, haunted eyes in a small, feral face. She was utterly alone. It was on the second day, while she was listlessly trying to dig for roots with a sharp stone, that a new presence entered her territory. These were not the loud, boastful hunters who had slain her mother. These men moved with a different purpose, their steps quiet and deliberate, their eyes scanning the ground, reading the stories written in the earth. They were a band of Arcadian hunters, men who lived in the foothills and knew the moods of Parthenian. Their leader was a man named Roetus, his face weathered like old leather, his eyes holding the patient wisdom of one who listens to the forest. They found the bear first. A murmur of respect and sorrow passed among them. They recognized her. She was the old she-bear of the high crags, a creature they had often seen and left in peace, a worthy sovereign of this mountain realm. To find her slain by crude spears, left to rot, was an offense to their code. Roetus knelt, placing a hand on the stiffened fur. "A great spirit is gone," he murmured, "killed by men with no respect." It was then that one of the younger hunters, a man with sharp eyes, gestured towards the tree line. "Roetus, look!" There, half hidden behind the gnarled roots of the ancient oak, was the child. She was crouched low, her body tense, her eyes fixed on them with a mixture of fear and a defiant, feral fury. She was thin, her ribs visible beneath the dirt-smudged skin, but there was a wiry strength in her limbs, a potential for speed and power. Her hair was a wild nest, and in her hand she clutched the sharp stone like a weapon. The hunters stared, their superstitious dread returning. A child living with a bear, surviving alone in these heights? It was unheard of. "By the gods," one whispered, "a bear whelp, a nymph of Artemis." Roetus, older and less prone to fantastical conclusions, saw something else. He saw a human child, abandoned and miraculously preserved. He slowly, carefully set his bow and quiver on the ground. He held his empty hands out to his sides, showing he meant no harm. He took a single, slow step forward. The girl reacted instantly. A low growl rumbled in her chest, a sound utterly inhuman. She bared her small teeth, her body coiling to spring or to flee. Roetus stopped. He did not look directly into her eyes, knowing a predator would interpret that as a challenge. Instead, he spoke, his voice a soft, steady murmur, like the stream nearby. "Little one," he said, "the danger is past. We will not hurt you." He took a water skin from his belt and, moving with infinite slowness, placed it on the ground between them. Then he retreated a few steps. The girl's eyes darted from the man to the water skin. Her thirst was a raging fire. After a long, tense moment, she darted forward with a speed that made the hunters gasp. She snatched the water skin and retreated back to her hiding spot, her eyes never leaving them. She drank greedily, water trickling down her chin. Next, Roetus took a strip of dried venison from his pouch. He repeated the process, laying it on the ground and retreating. This time, her hesitation was shorter. Hunger overpowered suspicion. She grabbed the meat and tore into it with her teeth, consuming it with a raw, animalistic intensity. For the next hour, Roicus repeated this ritual of patience. He offered food, water, and a consistent, non-threatening presence. The other hunters stood back, a silent, respectful audience to this delicate negotiation between civilization and the wild. Slowly, infinitely slowly, the tension left the girl's body. The growling ceased. The furious defiance in her eyes softened into a wary curiosity. Finally, Roitus sat down on a moss-covered log, making himself small, unassuming. He began to hum an old hunting tune, a simple, melodic line that echoed the natural rhythms of the forest. The girl listened. The sound was not a threat. It was a vibration in the air, steady and calming. She took a tentative step out from behind the roots, then another. She crept closer, her head cocked, studying this strange, patient man who made gentle sounds and offered food. When she was within arm's reach, Roitus did not move to grab her. He simply continued to hum, his gaze soft and focused on the distant trees. The girl reached out a small, dirty hand and touched the worn leather of his boot. It was the first voluntary, non-aggressive contact she had made with a human being since her abandonment. Roitus felt a profound shift in the air, a fragile bridge being built across an unimaginable chasm. He slowly, ever so slowly, brought his hand down and let her sniff his knuckles, just like he would with a nervous animal. She recoiled at first, then sniffed again. "Your world is gone, little cub," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "But a new one awaits. Come with us, you will be safe." He did not know if she understood the words, but he hoped she understood the tone of protection, of care. He stood up, turned, and began to walk slowly down the mountain path. He did not look back, pouring all his faith into this moment. His heart hammered against his ribs. Would she follow? A moment passed. Then two. He heard the soft, almost silent patter of small feet on the path behind him. He allowed himself a small, weary smile. The bear whelp had chosen to follow. The hunt for a lost child was over. The long, complex journey of raising her was about to begin. The naming of Atalanta. The descent from Mount Parthenian was a journey between worlds. For the feral girl, every step away from the high crags was a step into a realm of terrifying strangeness. The air grew thicker, warmer, heavy with scents she did not recognize. Wood smoke, cultivated earth, the dense smell of many humans living in close quarters. The sounds changed too. The pure, sharp notes of the wilderness were replaced by the distant, muffled bleating of sheep, the barking of dogs, and a low, constant hum of activity. She stayed close to Roitus, her small hand now firmly clutching the worn leather of his hunting tunic. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, scanned the new environment, missing nothing. She saw men tilling fields with oxen, their movements slow and rhythmic. She saw women weaving outside small stone huts, their hands flying with a dexterity she found fascinating. Children stopped their games to stare at the wild child brought down from the mountain, their whispers hanging in the air like mist. Roitus's home was on the outskirts of the main village, a sturdy dwelling of stone and timber with a roof of packed clay. It was a place of simple, functional comfort, filled with the tools of his trade. Bows and spears leaning in a corner, stretched pelts curing on frames, the scent of tanning leather and dried herbs. His wife, Ilara, was a woman whose kindness was etched into the lines around her eyes. When Roitus pushed open the wooden door and the girl peered in from behind him, Ilara's hand flew to her mouth. She was not a mythical creature, but a terrified, undernourished child. "The gods have brought her to us, Ilara," Roetus said quietly. "She has no one." Ilara's maternal instincts, which had long yearned for a child of her own, surged forth, overwhelming any shock or fear. She knelt, her skirts pooling around her, and offered a warm, genuine smile. "Welcome, little one," she said, her voice like the soft crackle of the hearth fire. "You are home now." The girl did not understand the word home, but the warmth in the woman's voice and the lack of threat in her posture were clear. The next hours were a series of gentle, patient introductions to human life. Ilara prepared a warm broth, and the girl, after sniffing it suspiciously, consumed it with the same frantic haste she had the dried meat. The warmth spreading through her belly was a new and pleasant sensation. Then came the bath. The sight of the wooden tub filled with steam and water sent the girl into a panic. She scrambled backwards, hissing, her eyes wide with terror. Water, to her, was for drinking from streams, not for immersion. It took both Roetus and Ilara the better part of an hour to coax her, using soft words and a piece of honeycomb as a lure, into the tub. The feeling of warm water on her skin was initially alarming, then strangely soothing. Ilara, with infinite patience, washed away 2 years of grime and forest life, revealing skin pale from lack of sun and a fine, strong bone structure beneath. When she was clean and wrapped in a soft woven blanket, she looked like a different child. The wildness was still in her eyes, but the outer layer of feral grime was gone. She was exhausted, her body swaying with fatigue. Ilara led her to a pile of furs in a corner, a bed. The girl looked at it, then at Ilara, confusion on her face. She was accustomed to sleeping curled on the earth. She gingerly lay down on the furs, her body tense, but the softness was a luxury her exhausted form could not resist. Within moments, she was asleep, her breath evening out into a deep, trusting rhythm for the first time since her bear mother had died. Her education began the next day. It was a slow, often frustrating process. She had no language. She communicated through grunts, points, and a complex vocabulary of expressions. She had to be taught everything: how to use a spoon, that food could be cooked, that certain sounds from Ilara's mouth, water, bread, sleep, corresponded to specific things or actions. Her relationship with Roetus was different. With him, she needed no words. He was her bridge back to the world she understood. He would take her with him to the edge of the forest, not to hunt at first, but simply to be there. He taught her the names of things in the human tongue: oak, hawk, deer. She learned with a rapidity that astonished him. Her mind, sharpened by survival, was a sponge, absorbing information with a fierce intensity. Months passed, then a year. The feral child began to fade, replaced by a quiet, observant girl who was slowly learning the ways of people. Yet the wildness was not gone. It was merely submerged, a current flowing just beneath the surface. She was always most at peace when she was outside, her gaze forever drawn to the looming silhouette of Mount Parthenion. One evening, during the festival of Artemis, the village gathered for a feast. A great bonfire leaped towards the starry sky, and the air was filled with the smell of roasting meat and the sound of flutes. The girl, now perhaps 3 years old, sat between Roetus and Ilara, watching the proceedings with her usual silent intensity. One part of the ritual, the village elder was bestowing names upon newborn children and animals, a practice meant to invite the goddess's protection. Roetus looked at the girl beside him. She had been with them for over a year, yet she had no name. She was not truly theirs to name, and yet she was. He stood and approached the elder, speaking in a low voice. A murmur ran through the crowd. All eyes turned to the wild child from the mountain. The elder, a venerable man with a long white beard, nodded. He called the girl forward. She went, her steps hesitant but sure, standing before him with a dignity that belied her years. Rhoetus spoke, his voice carrying over the crackle of the fire. She was found on the mountain, a child of the wilderness, equal to the hunt, unmatched in spirit. She is strong, she is swift, she is unwavering. The elder placed a gnarled hand on her head. He looked up at the constellation of the Great Bear, shining brightly in the northern sky, the same bear that had been her first protector. "The gods have preserved you, child," he intoned. "They have made you balanced and unshakable in your soul. Your spirit is in perfect equilibrium with the wild. Henceforth, you shall be known as Atalanta." The name meant balanced and unwavering. It was a perfect description of her essence. The villagers repeated the name, "Atalanta, Atalanta." The girl, Atalanta, looked up at the night sky, at the constellation of her foster mother. She did not smile, but a profound sense of rightness settled over her. For the first time, she had an identity, a sound that belonged to her and her alone. She was no longer the abandoned infant, the bear whelp, the wild child. She was Atalanta, and she would spend the rest of her life ensuring the world knew what that name meant. The first bow. The name Atalanta became a skin she learned to wear, a mantle of human identity that settled over her wild spirit. It did not tame her. It gave her a focus, a channel for the fierce, untamed energy that coursed through her veins. Life in Rhoetus and Ilara's home was a study in contrasts. The warmth of the hearth, the softness of woven wool, the predictable rhythm of meals. These were comforts her body accepted, while her soul remained restless, its gaze forever fixed on the dark line of the forest. Ilara taught her the domestic arts, how to grind grain on a flat stone, the rhythmic twist of the spindle that drew thread from a pile of wool, the careful stitch that could mend a torn tunic. Atalanta's hands, so deft at climbing and digging, were clumsy with these tasks. Her fingers, which could sense the slightest vibration in the earth, fumbled with the delicate fibers. She would sit for hours, her body present in the dim, smoky hut, but her mind was running through sun-dappled glades, scaling wind-scoured cliffs, feeling the phantom warmth of a bear's flank beside her. Ilara watched her with a mixture of affection and concern, recognizing a spirit too vast to be contained within four walls. It was with Rhoetus that Atalanta truly came alive. Their forays into the woods were her real education. He was a quiet teacher, his lessons embedded in action and observation. He showed her how to read the subtle language of the forest, the meaning behind a snapped twig, the story told by a disturbed patch of moss, the different shades of meaning in a deer's track, whether it was grazing calmly or fleeing in panic. "The forest speaks," Rhoetus would murmur, his voice low to blend with the ambient sounds. "You must learn to quiet your own mind to hear its voice." Atalanta needed no such lesson in silence. She was a creature of it. She could move through the undergrowth with a fluid grace that made no more sound than a shadow shifting with the sun. She learned to distinguish the scent of a fox from a badger, to identify edible roots and berries, to find the hidden sources of fresh water. She was a natural student, her instincts honed by her feral childhood now being refined by Rhoetus's knowledge. Her greatest fascination, however, was with Rhoetus's bow. It was a thing of beauty and power, crafted from seasoned yew wood, polished to a deep glow by the oil of his hands. She watched, mesmerized, when he practiced. The process was a ritual. The careful selection of an arrow from the quiver, the notch of the sinew string, the slow, powerful draw of the cord that bent the wood into a tense curve, the breath held, the release. a sharp thwip followed by the satisfying thunk of the arrow burying itself in the target. She wanted to do that. The desire was a physical ache in her arms. One afternoon, when she was perhaps 6 years old, she pointed to the bow leaning against the wall of the hut. "I want to learn," she said, her voice still rough from disuse, but the words clear. Rhoetus studied her. He saw the fierce determination in her eyes, a look that held no childish whimsy but the focused intent of a predator. He glanced at Alara, who gave a slight, hesitant nod. It was unheard of for a girl to train with a weapon of war, yet nothing about Atalanta was usual. "It is not a toy," Rhoetus said, his tone grave. "It is an extension of your will. It demands respect, discipline, and strength. Are you prepared for that?" Atalanta merely nodded, her gaze unwavering. The next day, Rhoetus presented her with a small bow he had crafted through the night. It was a simple thing, made from a flexible branch of ash with a string of woven gut. It was sized for her small frame, but it was a real bow. He also gave her 3 blunt-tipped arrows, their fletching made from goose feathers. Her first lesson was in the sun-drenched meadow behind their home. Rhoetus stood behind her, his large, calloused hands guiding her small ones. He showed her how to stand, feet planted firmly, body turned sideways to present a narrower profile. He corrected her grip on the bow's handle, her placement of the arrow on the string. "The strength is not just in your arms," he murmured, his voice close to her ear. "It comes from your back, your legs, your core. You must become a single, living spring, storing energy before you release it." Atalanta listened, her entire being focused on his words and the feel of the wood in her hand. Her first attempts were comical. The bow was difficult to draw, her small muscles straining. The arrows wobbled in the air, flying erratically before thudding into the grass a few paces away. Frustration, a hot, unfamiliar emotion, bubbled up inside her. She was accustomed to her body obeying her will with instinctual perfection. This required a different kind of control, a conscious, learned mastery. But giving up was not in her nature. Day after day, she practiced. While other village girls played with dolls or helped with weaving, Atalanta was in the meadow, her small face a mask of concentration. Her fingers became raw, then calloused. The muscles in her back and shoulders, already strong from climbing, grew hard and defined. She practiced until her arms trembled with fatigue, until the motion of drawing the bow became as natural as breathing. Weeks turned into months. The erratic flights became straighter. The blunt arrows began to consistently strike the straw-stuffed deerskin Rhoetus had set up as a target. The thwip thunk became a satisfying rhythm that marked the passage of her days. Then came the moment of truth. Rhoetus took her on a proper hunt, not to participate but to observe. They tracked a young deer to a clearing where it was grazing, its head down, unaware of their presence. Rhoetus notched an arrow, but then he paused. He looked at Atalanta, then at her small bow. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, frantic rhythm. This was different from shooting a stationary target. This was life and death. She could feel the eyes of the forest upon her. She notched one of her arrows, the motion now smooth and automatic. She mimicked Rhoetus's stance, her small body becoming the living spring he had described. She drew the string, the familiar strain a comfort. She focused, not on the whole deer, but on a single point just behind its shoulder. Time seemed to slow. The world narrowed to the line of her arrow, the beat of her own heart, and the oblivious animal. She released the string. The arrow flew true. It was not a killing shot. It lacked the power to penetrate deeply. But it struck the deer high on the flank. The animal started, let out a startled bleat, and bounded into the trees. Atalanta stood frozen, a mixture of disappointment and a strange, thrilling exhilaration coursing through her. She had missed the kill, but she had hit a living, moving target. She had taken the first step from being a child of the wild to being a master of it. Roethotus placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. "You did not bring it down," he said, his voice neutral. "But you found your mark. The forest felt your will today. Next time, your will shall be stronger." Atalanta looked down at the small bow in her hand. It was no longer just a tool, it was a part of her. She had tasted the power of the hunt, the intimate connection between hunter and prey. A deep, solemn understanding settled in her young heart. This was her path. This was her purpose. She was Atalanta, and she would become unmatched. The centaur's shadow. The years flowed like the mountain streams, carving their mark upon the land and upon Atalanta. The scrawny wild child was now a girl on the cusp of adolescence, her body a lithe composition of sinew and lean muscle. Her hair, the color of rich chestnut, was usually tied back in a simple plait, but strands of it often escaped to frame a face that was more striking than conventionally pretty. Her features were sharp and finely drawn, her skin tanned to a golden hue by the sun. But it was her eyes that held people. A piercing, direct gaze, the color of forest shadows, possessing an ancient, untameable quality that made both young men and elders uneasy. Her reputation within the village and the surrounding lands of Arcadia was a thing of whispers and sidelong glances. She was Roethotus's foundling, the bear girl who could outrun any boy her age and whose skill with the bow was becoming the stuff of local legend. The mothers clucked their tongues, pitying Alara for a daughter who would never make a suitable wife. The young men, both intrigued and intimidated, kept their distance, unsure how to interact with a girl who could likely best them in a foot race and whose conversation was of tracking and stalking, not of dances and festivals. Atalanta, for her part, was largely oblivious to their chatter. Her world was the forest, Roetus, and the relentless pursuit of her own skill. She had long since graduated from the small ash bow. She now wielded a powerful hunting bow of polished yew, comparable to the one Roetus carried, and she could draw it with an ease that belied her slender frame. Her arrows flew with a deadly accuracy that was no longer a matter of luck, but of consummate skill. It was this skill that Roetus decided to test on a journey to the high hunting grounds near the foothills of Mount Manalis, a region that bordered the wild, untamed territories of the centaurs. These creatures, half man and half horse, were notorious for their savage nature and their disdain for the laws of men. Most hunters gave their lands a wide berth. "The best game is often found where others fear to tread," Roetus told Atalanta as they packed their supplies. "But caution must be our constant companion. The centaurs are not like the wolves or the bears. They are cunning, and they hold a deep grudge against the race of men." Atalanta listened, her excitement tempered by his serious tone. This was not a routine hunt. It was a rite of passage. They traveled for 2 days, climbing into a rugged landscape of jagged gray stone and stunted, wind-twisted pines. The air was thin and cold, carrying the scent of time and distant snow. On the 3rd morning, they found the trail of a massive ibex, its cloven hoofprints deep in the soft earth of a high meadow. The trail led them along a narrow ridge, with a sheer drop on one side and a steep, rocky slope on the other. They had just cornered the magnificent beast, its great curved horns silhouetted against the sky, when a thunderous sound echoed from the slope below. It was the sound of many hooves pounding the earth, a rhythmic, aggressive drumbeat. Rhoetus's face tightened. He grabbed Atalanta's arm and pulled her behind a large outcrop of rock. A moment later, a band of centaurs burst into the clearing where the ibex had been. There were 4 of them, their human torsos muscular and bronzed, their horse bodies powerful and sleek. Their faces were brutish, with flat noses and wild, unruly hair. They carried crude but effective weapons, large clubs of knotted wood, and, in the case of their leader, a heavy spear. They had not come for the ibex. Their eyes scanned the ridge and quickly found Rhoetus and Atalanta. "Men!" the lead centaur roared, his voice a hoarse bray. "You trespass on the sacred grounds of the centaur tribe. You will pay with your lives." He gestured, and 2 of the younger centaurs began to charge up the slope towards them, their powerful legs eating up the distance with terrifying speed. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced Atalanta's heart. This was a different kind of danger. This was intelligent, malicious intent. Rhoetus was already moving. "Atalanta, the bow!" he barked, his own weapon coming up. But the centaurs were fast, too fast. One of them, a brute with a red beard, leaped on to the ridge, his club swinging in a wide, bone-shattering arc. Rhoetus dodged, but the movement put him off balance near the edge of the precipice. Time seemed to fracture into a series of sharp, frozen images. Atalanta saw the second centaur closing in. She saw Rhoetus, his footing precarious. She saw the lead centaur laughing, a cruel, mocking sound. A cold clarity washed over her, extinguishing the fear. Her world narrowed to the threat, the bow in her hand, and the man who was her father in all but blood. She did not think, she acted. In one fluid motion, she notched an arrow, drew, and released. The arrow took the charging red-bearded centaur high in the shoulder of his human torso. He roared in pain and surprise, stumbling, his charge broken. The lead centaur's laughter died. His eyes, burning with fury, locked onto Atalanta. "The girl!" he snarled, leveling his spear. But Atalanta was already moving again. She was a blur of motion, a dancer in a deadly ballet. She scrambled higher up the rocks, putting distance between herself and the attackers, gaining a better angle. Rhoetus, seizing the distraction, regained his footing and let loose an arrow that whistled past the lead centaur's head, forcing him to duck. The centaurs, now wounded and faced with unexpected resistance, hesitated. Their initial reckless charge was gone, replaced by a wary assessment. They were hunters who had become the hunted. Atalanta stood on a high rock, the wind whipping her hair. She had another arrow notched. Her breathing was steady, her gaze unwavering. She looked down at the savage creatures, not with the fear of a child, but with the cold assessment of a predator guarding her own. The lead centaur met her gaze. He saw no panic there, only a chilling, balanced lethality. This was no ordinary human girl. This was something else, a spirit of the crags themselves, and her bow was an extension of its will. To continue the fight was to risk more than they had bargained for. With a guttural curse, he gestured to his companions. "Back! The mountain spirits protect this one!" The centaurs turned, the wounded one supported by his kin, and thundered back down the slope, their rage replaced by a grudging, superstitious fear. Silence returned to the ridge, broken only by the sigh of the wind. Atalanta slowly lowered her bow, her body trembling now that the immediate danger had passed. Rhoetus walked to her, his face pale but filled with a profound, fierce pride. He looked at the girl who had just saved his life, who had faced down a band of mythical monsters with the cool precision of a veteran warrior. "You were unwavering," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Today, Atalanta, you were not just my daughter, you were my fellow hunter." He did not embrace her. Such a display was not their way. But the respect in his eyes was a reward greater than any embrace. Atalanta felt a new kind of strength solidify within her. She had proven herself, not in the hunt for game, but in the defense of her own. The shadow of the centaurs had fallen upon her, and she had not flinched. She had stood balanced and unwavering, living up to her name in the most profound way possible. The Boar of Caledon. The confrontation with the centaurs became a scar upon the memory of the region, a story told and retold in hushed tones around winter fires. It solidified Atalanta's reputation, transforming her from a local curiosity into a figure of near mythic stature. Whispers followed her now, not just of a girl raised by a bear, but of a huntress who had stared down the savage sons of Ixion and made them retreat. She carried this new mantle with her typical, silent indifference, her focus remaining on the tangible world of the hunt, the feel of the bowstring against her calloused fingers, the rhythm of her own breathing as she tracked prey through the dappled light of the forest. She was 16, her body having attained its full height, a lean, powerful form that moved with an economy of motion that was beautiful to behold and intimidating to confront. Her relationship with the village remained one of respectful distance. She was Roetus's daughter, and that granted her a certain protection, but the mothers no longer spoke of finding her a husband. They looked at her now with a kind of fearful awe. Us, one might regard a sacred but dangerous animal. She was, in their eyes, consecrated to a different destiny. That destiny announced itself one autumn afternoon when the air was crisp with the promise of frost and the leaves of the oak trees blazed with fiery color. A rider came to their village, a herald from a kingdom far to the west, his tunic dusty and his horse lathered with sweat. He carried a message that was both a proclamation and a desperate plea. He stood in the center of the village square, unrolling a scroll, his voice ringing out in the clear, cold air. "Hear the words of Oenis, king of Calydon," he cried. "A great calamity has befallen our land. A monstrous boar, a beast of unparalleled size and ferocity, sent by the wrath of the goddess Artemis herself, ravages our fields, destroys our vineyards, and slaughters our livestock and any man who dares to face it. Its hide is impervious to spear and arrow, its tusks are like polished ivory swords, and its eyes burn with a hellish fire. King Oenis calls upon the greatest heroes of all Hellas to gather in Calydon for a great hunt. He offers rich rewards and undying glory to the one who can slay this beast." A buzz of excitement ran through the crowd. The Caledonian boar hunt. It was the kind of event that defined a generation of heroes. Names were mentioned: Meleager, the king's own son, the mighty Dioscuri from Sparta, the great warrior Theseus from Athens, the swift Idas and Lynceus. This was an affair for kings and demigods, for the men whose deeds would be sung for centuries. Atalanta stood at the edge of the crowd, her heart pounding with a sudden, fierce longing. This was not about glory or reward. It was about the hunt, the ultimate hunt, a beast that could not be slain by ordinary means, a challenge that called to the very core of her being. That evening, she found Roetus oiling his best spear, his face grim. "You will go," she stated, her voice not asking a question. Roetus looked up, his eyes weary. "I am a hunter of Arcadia, child, not a hero seeking fame. This boar is a creature of divine anger. The hunt will be a bloody affair. Many will die." "Then they are poor hunters," Atalanta replied, her tone devoid of arrogance, merely stating a fact she believed to be self-evident. "I am going with you." Rhoetus set down his spear. He had known this was coming. He had seen the fire in her eyes when the herald spoke. He had trained her, nurtured her skill, and in doing so, he had created something that could no longer be contained within the forests of Arcadia. She was a blade forged for a greater purpose. "Atalanta," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "this is not a hunt for a woman. The heroes who will gather there, they are proud men. They will not accept you. They may even see your presence as an insult, a bad omen." "I do not seek their acceptance," she said, her gaze level and unwavering. "I seek the boar. My arrow flies as true as any man's. My arm is as steady. My courage is my own. You taught me that the hunt is the only truth. This is the greatest hunt. I will not be left behind." She did not plead. She did not argue. She simply declared her intent, and the absolute certainty in her voice filled the small hut. Ilara, who had been listening from the hearth, looked from her husband's troubled face to her daughter's resolute one. She saw the inevitable. "She is not a child anymore, Rhoetus," Ilara said softly. "She is Atalanta. The forest itself could not hold her. Do you think you can?" Rhoetus held Atalanta's gaze for a long, silent moment. He saw the ghost of the she-bear in her eyes, the same fierce, protective love she had shown on the ridge, now turned outward toward a colossal challenge. He saw the hunter he had crafted, poised and ready. He also saw the girl he loved, and the thought of her facing that monster sent a chill of terror through his soul. But to forbid her would be to break her spirit, to deny the very essence of who she was. With a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all his fears and all his pride, he nodded. "So be it. We go to Calydon." The journey was long, taking them across the wild heart of the Peloponnese and north into Aetolia. The world changed around them. The familiar rounded hills of Arcadia gave way to the steeper, more dramatic landscapes of the north. They traveled with a small group of Arcadian hunters who had also answered the call, men who knew and respected Rhoetus, and who, after the tale of the centaurs, regarded Atalanta with a wary deference. When they finally arrived in Calydon, the air was thick with tension and the boastful clamor of gathered heroes. The palace courtyard was a riot of color and noise. Gleaming bronze armor reflected the sun. Powerful men, their bodies scarred from countless battles, stood in groups, their laughter loud and confident. There were the twins, Castor and Pollux, inseparable and radiant. There was Theseus, his intelligent eyes taking in everything. There was Peleus, the father of a yet unborn great hero. And there was Meleager, the prince of Calydon, a young man with a passionate intensity in his eyes, who was organizing the hunt. When Rhoetus and his party entered, a silence fell over the crowd. The heroes stared. They saw a party of rough Arcadian hunters, and among them a young woman. She wore a simple tunic of deerskin, her bow slung across her back, her hair tied back practically. She carried herself not with the shyness of a maiden, but with the calm, observant confidence of a fellow warrior. Whispers turned into loud, angry protests. "A woman! What is the meaning of this? This is an insult to the hunt. She will bring the wrath of Artemis upon us all. Send her away. This is no place for a girl." The objections came from all sides, most loudly from a pair of uncles of Meleager, thick-necked, boorish men named Plexippus and Toxius. Their faces were flushed with wine and indignation. Meleager stepped forward, his hand raised for silence. His eyes, however, were not on the protesting men, but on Atalanta. He looked at her, really looked, and what he saw struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was not her beauty, though she was beautiful in a wild, untamed way. It was her bearing. She stood amidst a scorn and anger of the greatest heroes in Greece, utterly unshaken, her expression one of cool assessment, as if she were the one judging their fitness for the hunt. A powerful, immediate admiration, tinged with something more, flared within him. Rhoetus stepped forward, his voice steady. "Prince Meleager, this is my daughter, Atalanta of Arcadia. Her skill with the bow is unmatched. She has faced and turned back a band of centaurs. She has earned the right to be here." Laughter and jeers met his words. Meleager silenced them with a sharp gesture. His gaze never left Atalanta. "Is this true?" he asked her directly, his voice cutting through the noise. Atalanta met his eyes. "The truth will be found in the hunt, not in this courtyard," she replied, her voice clear and carrying. "My arrow will speak for me." A fresh wave of outrage came from Plexippus. "Meleager, do not be a fool. This is a disgrace. If you allow this, I will not participate." Meleager's jaw tightened. He felt the eyes of all the heroes upon him, testing his leadership. He looked at Atalanta's unwavering gaze, then at the bloated, angry faces of his uncles. A choice lay before him: the stale tradition of his elders, or the thrilling, dangerous potential of this extraordinary huntress. "The hunt is for those with the skill and courage to face the beast," Meleager declared, his voice ringing with authority. "I care not if they are man or woman, king or commoner. Atalanta of Arcadia will hunt with us." His decision was met with a mixture of grumbling acceptance and shocked silence. The hunt had not yet begun, and the first battle of wills had already been fought and won. Atalanta had secured her place, not through plea or argument, but through the sheer, undeniable force of her presence. The great hunt was about to begin, and the swift-footed huntress from the Arcadian mountains stood ready, an outsider who would soon become the central figure in the legend. The Hunter's Due. The morning of the hunt dawned gray and somber, the sun a pale, diluted coin behind a shroud of high cloud. A thick, wet mist clung to the low-lying marshes and vineyards of Caledon, muffling sound and reducing the world to a ghostly tableau of vague shapes and dripping foliage. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, crushed grapes, and the palpable tension of nearly 50 men, and one woman preparing to face a monster. They assembled at the edge of the great forest where the boar had its lair. The heroes were a cacophony of clattering bronze and loud, nervous bravado. Hounds, lean and muscular, strained at their leashes, their low growls and eager whines adding to the atmosphere of impending violence. Atalanta moved among them like a silent wraith. She had refused the heavy bronze cuirass offered to her, preferring the freedom of movement her deerskin tunic allowed. Her only concessions to the day were a sharp, heavy spear Rhoetus had insisted she carry, and her beloved yew-bow, its string carefully protected from the damp. She ignored the hostile glares from Plexippus and Toxius, and the more curious, sometimes lecherous, stares from others. Her entire being was focused, her senses stretched to their limits, reading the forest in a way the others could not. She heard the nervous chatter of jays deeper in the woods, a sign of recent disturbance. She smelled the faint, lingering musk of the boar on a tendril of breeze that wound its way through the mist. Meleager, his face set in lines of grim determination, gave the signal. The hounds were unleashed. With a unified, deafening chorus of barks and howls, they surged into the forest, a flowing river of fur and fury. The hunters followed, a tide of men and steel crashing into the undergrowth. The first hours were a trial of endurance and noise. The party spread out in a great, disorganized crescent, driving deeper into the boar's territory. The initial bravado soon faded, replaced by the grim, sweaty work of pushing through thorny thickets and slogging across muddy streams. Shouts echoed through the trees as men lost sight of each other in the fog. Atalanta, however, did not follow the main pack. With a glance at Roethus, who nodded his understanding, she broke away, moving to the flank. She was a huntress, not a beaters. Her role was not to drive the game, but to find it, to outthink it. She moved with an uncanny silence, her feet finding purchase on stones and fallen logs, avoiding the crackling layers of dead leaves. Her eyes scanned the ground, reading the story written there. She saw the devastation the boar had wrought, entire swaths of forest floor torn up as if by a giant plow, saplings snapped in two, the bark of older trees scarred and gouged from the beast rubbing its immense bristled flanks. The sheer scale of the destruction was awe-inspiring and terrifying. Suddenly, a change in the atmosphere prickled the hairs on her arms. The baying of the hounds, which had been a diffuse clamor, sharpened, coalescing into a focused, frenzied intensity from a gully ahead. This was followed by a series of agonized yelps, then silence. A moment later, a new sound erupted, a deep, guttural roaring that was not of this world, a sound of pure, malevolent rage that vibrated through the very ground. The beast was roused. Atalanta broke into a run, not the headlong, crashing sprint of the other hunters, but a swift, fluid lope that carried her effortlessly over the rough terrain. She burst into a small, marshy clearing just in time to see the aftermath of the first encounter. Two hounds lay dead, their bodies torn open with horrifying ease. A hunter from Thessaly was down, clutching a ruin of a leg, his screams cutting through the fog. And in the center of the clearing stood the Caledonian boar. It was larger than any telling of the tale could do justice. It was the size of a bull, its body a mass of knotted, gristly muscle covered in coarse, black bristles that were matted with mud and looked as tough as iron rings. Its head was enormous, with small, red-rimmed eyes that burned with a stupid, hateful intelligence. From its lower jaw curved tusks longer than a man's forearm, white and sharp, stained with the blood of the hounds. Its hot, foul breath plumed in the cold air like smoke from a forge. The first heroes arrived, their courage fueled by adrenaline and fear. They hurled their spears. The air whistled with projectiles. But the tales were true. The spears, thrown with the force of powerful arms, did not pierce the hide. They skittered off the beast's shoulders and flanks with a sound like stone striking metal, or lodged shallowly in the thick mat of bristles, doing no more than enraging the creature further. The boar charged. It moved with a speed that belied its bulk, a living avalanche of destruction. It plowed into a group of hunters from Arcadia, scattering them like ninepins. One man was too slow. A tusk caught him in the side, lifting him from his feet and tossing his broken body into a tree with a sickening crunch. Panic began to spread. The ordered hunt dissolved into chaos. Heroes who had boasted of their valor now scrambled for safety, their confidence shattered by the beast's invulnerability. Atalanta did not move. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her bow in her hand. She watched the boar, studying its movements. She saw the way it pivoted on its powerful legs, the way it lowered its head to charge, the pattern of its rage. The other saw a monster. She saw a target. As the boar finished its gory turn, preparing to charge another group, it presented its flank to her. But it was not the armored shoulder. There was a spot, just behind the foreleg, where the bristles were less dense, where the hide was presumably softer, where a well-placed shot might find a path to the heart or lungs. It was a tiny window, and it was closing fast. She notched an arrow. The world fell away. The screams, the fog, the fallen men, all vanished. There was only the bow, the arrow, the spot, and the rhythm of her own breath. She drew the string, the familiar strain a comfort in the midst of madness. She did not aim with her eyes alone, but with her entire being, her years of instinct and training coalescing into this single, perfect moment. She released. The arrow flew with a clean, sharp sound, a silver streak in the gray light. It did not ricochet. It sank deep into the boar's flank, precisely in the spot she had intended. The beast let out a shriek of pain, a sound so high-pitched and furious it silenced the entire forest. It was not a killing blow, but it was the first wound that had truly bitten deep, the first attack that had pierced its myth of invincibility. A rivulet of dark, crimson blood welled around the shaft, staining the black bristles. The effect on the hunters was electric. Their panic vanished, replaced by a surge of renewed hope. The beast could be wounded. The girl's arrow had done what all their spears could not. "The huntress!" someone shouted. "The Arcadian's arrow found its mark!" Meleager, his face alight with a fierce, triumphant joy, salad-law his cants. While the boar was distracted, twisting its head, trying to reach the source of this new, piercing agony in its side, he leaped forward. With all his strength, he drove his own heavy hunting spear deep into the beast's neck, angling it down, seeking the great arteries. It was the mortal blow. The boar staggered, its furious squeals turning into wet, choking gurgles. It thrashed wildly, its tusks slashing the air one last time, before its legs buckled and the colossal body crashed to the earth, shaking the ground. A profound silence fell, broken only by the ragged panting of the hunters and the final, dying spasms of the monster. Then a cheer went up, hesitant at first, then roaring and triumphant. They had done it. The Caledonian boar was slain. All eyes turned from the massive carcass to the slender figure of the huntress standing calmly at the edge of the clearing. She was already retrieving her arrow, wiping the bloodied tip on a tuft of grass. She had not killed the beast, but every man there knew the truth. Her shot had been the turning point. Her skill had broken the boar's spirit and its defense, creating the opening for Meleager's kill. Meleager strode through the crowd, his chest heaving, his eyes blazing with victory and something more personal, more intense. He ignored the boar. He walked directly to Atalanta. "The honor of the first blow is yours," he declared, his voice ringing out for all to hear. "Your arrow revealed its mortality. Your skill won this day. The hide, the tusks, the spoils, they are your hunter's due." He knelt, not in supplication, but in respect, and began the work of skinning the mighty beast, intending to present its prize to her. The celebration on the faces of the other heroes died, especially on the faces of Plexippus and Toxius. Their humiliation at being bested by a woman curdled into pure, venomous rage. The greatest trophy in a generation, and it was to be given to a girl? The battle was over, but a new, more treacherous conflict had just begun. The spoils of wrath. The triumph that should have echoed through the forests of Caledon curdled into something dark and venomous within the space of a single breath. The cheers that had greeted the boar's death fell away, replaced by a thick, hostile silence. All eyes were fixed on Meleager, their prince, who knelt in the churned, blood-soaked mud beside the colossal carcass, his knife already working at the base of the beast's thick neck. He was not merely claiming a trophy, he was performing a ritual of recognition, and the object of that recognition was the quiet huntress from Arcadia. Atalanta stood apart, her expression unreadable. She watched Meleager's work, her own bloody arrow now clean and safely stored in her quiver. She felt no overwhelming thrill of victory, only the cool satisfaction of a task completed with precision. The boar was a problem to be solved, and her arrow had been the key to the solution. The politics of glory and spoils were a foreign language, a noisy, confusing clamor that held no interest for her. Plexippus was the first to break the silence. His face, already flushed from exertion and the morning's wine, turned a deep, dangerous purple. "Meleager!" he roared, his voice cracking with outrage. "Have you lost your mind? You would give the spoils of this hunt, the trophy of a victory won by the greatest heroes of Hellas, to a girl?" His brother, Toxius, stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "The honor is yours by right of the killing blow, nephew. Or does the blood of our house now mean so little to you that you would spit on it for the sake of this forest witch?" The word witch hung in the damp air, ugly and accusatory. Other murmurs of agreement rose from the assembled hunters. The initial gratitude for Atalanta's crucial shot had been swiftly eclipsed by bruised male pride and ingrained tradition. A woman did not receive the spoils. A woman did not stand among them as an equal. Meleager did not look up from his work. His hands, slick with the boar's blood, continued their methodical task. When he spoke, his voice was low, but it carried a steely authority that cut through the muttering. The law of the hunt is clear. The first blood, the shot that turns the tide, holds its own honor. Atalanta's arrow found the beast's weakness when all our strength had failed. She has earned this. My blow was only possible because of hers. I will not be known as a prince who steals the glory from those who rightfully deserve it. This is not about glory, you fool, Plexippus spat, taking a menacing step forward. This is about the natural order. This is about the reputation of Calydon. Will the song say that our mightiest heroes were shown up by an Arcadian peasant girl? The spoils belong to you, and from you, they belong to your family, to us. The argument was no longer about a boar's hide. It was about power, lineage, and the deep-seated fear of a world turned upside down. Atalanta represented a threat to everything these men understood. Her skill was a challenge to their masculinity, her composure an insult to their chaotic bravado. Rhoetus moved to stand beside Atalanta, his spear held ready, his face a grim mask. The other Arcadian hunters closed ranks around them, a small, defiant island in a sea of rising anger. The camaraderie of the hunt had shattered, revealing the brittle alliances beneath. Meleager finally rose, the boar's massive, bristled hide now loose in his hands. He held it out, a great, black, dripping pelt, towards Atalanta. His eyes were bright with a fervent, almost desperate admiration. "Take it," he said, his voice softening when he looked at her. "It is your right." That single, tender glance, that shift in his tone, was the final spark. Plexippus Salalah said it not as an act of justice, but as an act of infatuation. He, Salalah, his nephew's judgment clouded by a pretty face, the legacy of their house being given away like a lover's token. "You disgrace our blood for this creature?" Plexippus snarled, and in a flash of drunken rage he drew his sword. "I will not allow it!" He did not move towards Atalanta. He moved towards Meleager, his own nephew, his blade glinting dully in the gray light. It was a challenge, a direct assault on the prince's authority. What happened next was a blur of tragic inevitability. Meleager, his own temper, a legendary and fatal flaw, ignited by the insult and the threat, dropped the hide and met the charge. He was younger, faster, and fueled by a righteous fury. He parried Plexippus's clumsy thrust and drove his own hunting knife, the very one he had used to skin the boar, deep into his uncle's chest. A collective gasp sucked the air from the clearing. Plexippus staggered back, his eyes wide with shock, looking down at the hilt protruding from his body. He crumpled to the ground, his blood pooling with the boar, a dark, tragic confluence. For a heartbeat, there was absolute stillness. The horror of the act, a kinslaying, froze everyone in place. Then, with a wordless scream of grief and rage, Toxus drew his own sword and charged Meleager. "Murderer! You have killed your own blood!" There was no hesitation this time. The dam of civility had burst. Meleager, his eyes wild with the madness of the moment, wrenched his knife free and met Toxus's charge. The fight was short, brutal, and fatal. Meleager, the triumphant hero of the hunt, now stood over the bodies of his two uncles, his hands dripping with the blood of his kin. The silence that followed was heavier than any that had come before. It was the silence of catastrophe. The victory was ashes. The great hunt was now a tale of family murder. The other heroes looked on in stunned disbelief, their previous anger replaced by a superstitious dread. This was the wrath of Artemis indeed, not in the boar's tusks, but in the discord she had sown among them. Meleager seemed to shrink. The fire in his eyes guttered and died, replaced by a hollow, horrified realization of what he had done. He looked at his bloody hands, then at the faces of the revolted heroes, and finally, his gaze found Atalanta. In her eyes, she saw no fear, no condemnation, but a deep, ancient sorrow. She understood the hunt, but this human chaos, this web of pride and violence, was the true monster, and it was a beast she wanted no part of. Without a word, Meleager turned and stumbled from the clearing, leaving the spoils, the dead, and his shattered honor behind. The hunt was over. The killing had only just begun. Atalanta looked at the boar's hide, lying discarded and bloody in the mud. It was no longer a trophy. It was a cursed thing, a catalyst for death. She felt the eyes of the remaining hunters upon her, their blame now a physical weight. She had come for the challenge of the hunt, but she had found herself at the center of a Greek tragedy. "We are leaving," Rhoetus said, his voice low and firm. He did not look at the spoils. There would be no reward, only infamy. Atalanta nodded. She turned her back on the scene of triumph and ruin, and without a single glance behind, she melted back into the forest from which she had come, the ghost of the hunt, leaving the heroes to their grief and their shame. The spoils of the hunt belonged to no one. They were simply the price of wrath. The Argo's Call. The journey back to Arcadia was a somber procession, a funeral march for a victory that had never truly been. The tale of the Caledonian boar hunt raced ahead of them, carried by merchants and travelers, but it was a distorted echo of the truth. In the popular telling, Meleager was the tragic hero, slain by his uncles or by the fates. The details were murky, sanitized by time and distance. The crucial role of the Arcadian huntress was a footnote, often omitted, her presence blamed for the divine discord. She was the harbinger of bad luck, the woman who had, directly or indirectly, caused the death of a prince and his kin. Atalanta found a strange peace in this notoriety. The whispers that had once been of curiosity were now of outright fear. and fear was a potent form of privacy. Men who might have sought her hand for her strange beauty now gave her a wide berth, crossing the street to avoid her gaze. She was left to her own devices, which was all she had ever truly wanted. Her days were spent in the deep woods with Rhoecus, their companionship now wordlessly deepened by the shared memory of Calydon's blood-soaked clearing. 2 years passed. Atalanta grew into the full power of her young adulthood. Her body was a marvel of natural engineering, all lean muscle and tensile strength. She could run for hours without tiring, her feet barely seeming to touch the earth. She could track a sparrow's flight through a dense canopy and bring down a stag with a single, clean shot from 100 paces. She was the perfect huntress, a living embodiment of Artemis's ideal, and she wore her solitude like a queen wears her crown. It was on a day when the summer heat lay heavy upon the land that a new kind of energy began to stir in the ports and royal courts of Greece. A new enterprise was afoot, one that dwarfed even the Caledonian hunt in its ambition. A prince from Iolcos, a man named Jason, was assembling a crew for a ship called the Argo. His goal was to voyage to the ends of the known world, to the kingdom of Colchis on the distant shore of the Black Sea, and retrieve the legendary Golden Fleece. The call went out for the mightiest, the cleverest, the most heroic men of the age. Hercules the strong, Orpheus the musician, Castor and Pollux the horseman, Telamon the mighty, and dozens of others. The list was a roll call of destiny. The Argonauts, they would be called. When the news reached their village, carried by a starry-eyed bard singing of the quest, Rhoecus watched Atalanta carefully. He saw the familiar fire kindle in her eyes, the same focused intensity he had seen when she first held a bow, the same longing that had driven her to Calydon. This was more than a hunt, it was the greatest adventure ever conceived. "You are thinking of it," he stated that evening, as they sat by the fire, Ilara mending a net. Atalanta looked up from honing the edge of her knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic sh-click paused. "A ship that sails to the edge of the world," she said, her voice quiet. "A fleece of gold guarded by a dragon. These are things from the old stories." "They are," Rhoecus agreed, "and the men who go will be the men from Calydon, and others like them. Their pride is still wounded, their memory is long." "I do not care for their memories," she replied, the sh-click resuming. "I care for the journey." "It is not a journey for a woman, Atalanta," Ilara said softly, her voice laced with a mother's fear. "The sea is a monster more unpredictable than any boar. The lands they will visit, they are places of sorcery and strange gods." "I am not any woman," Atalanta said, and it was not a boast, but a simple, unassailable truth. "My place is where the greatest challenge lies. Calydon proved that my skill has value, even if they refuse to honor it. Jason seeks the best. I am among the best." The logic was irrefutable. Rhoecus knew he could not chain this falcon to his perch. She had outgrown the forests of Arcadia. The world was calling, and her spirit was too vast to ignore the summons. A few days later, a small party of travelers arrived in the village, led by a man with an earnest, determined face and a single sandal. Jason himself had come, touring the Peloponnese to recruit the final members of his crew. He was hearing petitions in the village square, and a crowd had gathered to see the famous prince. When it was her turn, Atalanta stepped forward. The crowd, recognizing her, fell into a hushed, anticipatory silence. Jason looked at her, puzzled. "My lady," he began, "the petitions for the Argo are for—" "I am not a lady," Atalanta interrupted, her voice clear and carrying. "I am Atalanta of Arcadia. I was the first to draw blood from the Caledonian boar. My arrow never misses its mark. I can run from dawn until dusk without rest. I offer my skills to your quest." A ripple of laughter and shocked murmurs went through the crowd. Jason held up his hand for silence, his expression turning from puzzlement to keen interest. He had heard the rumors, the twisted tales of the boar hunt. He looked at her, really looked, and saw what Meleager had seen. Not a woman trying to be a man, but a person of unparalleled and focused capability. One of his companions, a grizzled warrior, leaned in and whispered, "Lord Jason, be cautious. This is the one they say brought a curse upon Caledon." Jason ignored him. His quest was too important to be hobbled by superstition. He needed the best. "Your reputation precedes you, Atalanta of Arcadia. But the Argo is a ship of warriors. What use is a runner or an archer on the high seas?" "An archer can defend a ship from shore-based attacks," she answered without hesitation. "A swift runner can scout unknown coasts faster than any man, bringing back knowledge while avoiding danger. My eyes are trained to see what others miss." On a quest for a magical fleece, perhaps it is the wild things, the things that do not belong in a warrior's hall, that will prove most valuable. Jason studied her. Her argument was practical, intelligent, and spoke to a strategic mind. He was assembling a team of specialists, and she was offering a unique set of skills none of his other heroes possessed. He saw not a bad omen, but a potential asset. After a long moment, he nodded. "The world we sail to is wild and strange. Perhaps it requires a wild and strange spirit to navigate it. Very well, Atalanta of Arcadia, you have a place on the Argo." The crowd erupted, but Atalanta did not smile. She merely gave a single sharp nod of acceptance. She had passed through the fire of Caledon and emerged tempered, harder, and more determined than ever to carve her own path, far from the stifling traditions of men. The boar had been a test. The Argo would be her proving ground. The huntress was going to sea. The voyage of the strange. The Argo was not a ship. It was a living, breathing creature of timber and ambition. Crafted from the sacred oaks of Mount Pelion by the master shipwright Argus, its hull curved like a leaping dolphin, its prow a sleek, threatening blade sheathed in bronze. The oars, when run out, were its many legs, and the great square sail, now billowing in the steady wind pushing them from the Pagasetic Gulf, was its beating heart. To Atalanta, who knew only the solid, unchanging earth, the deck was a disconcerting, ever-shifting plane. It pitched and rolled with a rhythm that was at once alien and hypnotic, a constant, gentle reminder that the world of men was a fragile thing upon the immense, indifferent body of the sea. She stood near the stern, away from the main press of the 50-odd heroes. Her deerskin tunic and practical stance marked her as an outsider among the gleaming bronze and boisterous camaraderie. The initial shock of her presence had settled into a tense, watchful acceptance. Some, like the gentle musician Orpheus, regarded her with a thoughtful curiosity. Others, like the mighty Hercules, seemed to view her as simply another piece of the quest's strange puzzle, neither man nor woman, but a tool to be used. But many, their minds poisoned by the distorted tales of Caledon, watched her with suspicion, their eyes saying what their mouths dared not: "You do not belong here." The first test came not from the men, but from the sea itself. A squall descended upon them with the sudden fury of a roused god. The sky turned the color of a bruised plum, and the waves, once playful, became rolling, black mountains, intent on crushing the tiny vessel. The Argo groaned, its timbers protesting under the strain. Rain fell not in drops, but in solid, stinging sheets. and the wind screamed in the rigging, a malevolent spirit trying to tear the sail to ribbons. The Argonauts, for all their strength, were landsmen. They stumbled on the slick deck, their powerful muscles useless against the chaotic lurching. They heaved and bailed, their shouts lost in the storm's roar, their faces masks of fear. Atalanta, however, found her footing. The unpredictable deck was not so different from the shifting scree of a mountain slope or the uneven floor of a dark forest. Her body, trained for balance and swift reactive adjustments, learned the rhythm of the waves faster than any of the others. While men slid and fell, she moved with a dancer's grace, her feet always finding purchase. She saw not chaos, but patterns. She watched the way the ship rode the swell, anticipating its roll before it happened. When a great wave crashed over the starboard whale, sweeping 2 men towards the churning black water, it was Atalanta who moved. She was a flash of motion in the gloom. Uncoiling like a spring, she lunged, one hand snatching the arm of a young hero named Hylas, the other grabbing a loose coil of rope. She anchored herself against a rowing bench, her body a taut, unyielding line against the sea's pull, and hauled the sputtering man back to safety. No one cheered. There was no time. That in the glances exchanged between the drenched, exhausted men, a flicker of something new appeared. It was not yet respect, but a dawning recognition. The girl was not a passive burden. She was capable. When the storm finally passed, leaving a bruised, quiet sea and a sky scrubbed clean, the mood on the ship was subdued. They made landfall on a small, rocky island to make repairs and take on fresh water. It was here that Atalanta's second skill proved its worth. The island was a place of steep, forested cliffs and hidden coves. Jason needed to find a fresh water source quickly. Lynceus, he said to the man with the fabled sharpest sight, climb to the highest point, see if you can spot a spring. Lynceus, proud of his gift, scrambled up the cliff face. He stood at the summit, his hand shielding his eyes, scanning the interior. I see. Trees, my lord, many trees, and a ridge to the north. He, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the macro, the large shapes of the land. But Atalanta, while he was climbing, had not been idle. She was on her hands and knees at the edge of the beach, her nose close to the ground, her eyes reading the subtle language of the earth. The water is this way, she said, straightening up and pointing not inland, but along a narrow, almost invisible game trail that wound through a fissure in the cliffs. Lynceus scoffed from his perch. I see no water there, huntress, only rock. The animals know where to drink, she replied, her tone flat. The trail is well trodden. The moss on these rocks grows thickest facing the sea breeze, which carries moisture from a freshwater source nearby. The air here tastes different, sweeter. She did not wait for debate. She set off down the trail, moving with her characteristic silent speed. After a moment of hesitation, Jason gestured for a few men to follow her. The trail twisted and turned, leading them not up, but down into a secluded, sun-dappled gorge hidden from the view of the summit. And there, just as she had said, was a clear, cold spring bubbling up from a cleft in the rock, feeding a small stream that trickled towards the sea. The men who had followed her stared, then looked back at each other. Lynceus' eyes could see a bird in the sky a league away, but he could not see the story written on the ground at his feet. Atalanta could. She possessed a different kind of sight, a deep, empathetic reading of the natural world that was, on this wild, unknown coast, more valuable than any supernatural gift. From that day forward, her role on the Argo solidified. She was not one of the boys. She was not a fellow warrior in the melee. She was their scout, their pathfinder, their wildness made manifest. When they made landfall on the hostile coast of the Bebryces, it was Atalanta who slipped ashore first, her body painted with mud to break her outline, and returned with a detailed map of the king's defensive positions, allowing Jason to plan a successful assault. When they were lost in the foggy marshes of Thrace, it was she who found the safe channel by listening to the calls of the waterfowl and feeling the pull of the hidden currents. She earned no grand titles. They did not compose songs about her scouting missions. But the suspicious glances were gradually replaced by nods of acknowledgement. A place was cleared for her at the oars, not because she was as strong as Hercules, but because her steady, tireless rhythm was reliable. When rations were low, it was often her arrow that brought down a goat on a seemingly inaccessible cliffside, providing meat for the crew. She had carved a niche for herself, a space that was entirely her own. On the deck of the Argo, surrounded by the greatest heroes of the age, Atalanta was no longer just the woman who had been at Calydon. She was the swift one, the eyes of the Argo, a vital, if silent thread in the tapestry of their epic quest. The voyage was strange, but she, in her own way, was the strangest and most necessary part of it all. The clashing rocks and the witch priestess. The world beyond the Hellespont was a place of waking dreams and primordial terrors. The sea itself seemed older, its water a deeper, colder blue, its shores lined with jagged, unfamiliar rock formations that looked like the broken teeth of forgotten giants. The air thrummed with a latent magic that set Atalanta's teeth on edge, a sensation both thrilling and deeply unsettling. This was the realm of the myth, and the Argo was a splinter of mortal ambition drifting into its heart. Their first great trial in this new world was the Symplegades, the clashing rocks. Two colossal, living cliffs that guard the entrance to the Bosphorus. They roamed the narrow strait, crashing together with the force of an earthquake, grinding any vessel caught between them to splinters and pulp. The roar of their collision echoed for miles, a constant, grim drumbeat of warning. The Argonauts fell silent, their boisterous confidence draining away as they beheld the phenomenon. Even Hercules' famed strength was useless here. This was a test of wit, timing, and nerve. It was the seer, Phineus, who had given them the key. Release a dove. If the dove passed through, the ship could follow in the wake of its flight. A dove was procured, a trembling white speck against the immense gray rocks. The tension on the Argo was a physical force, thick enough to taste. Atalanta stood with the others, her eyes fixed on the bird as it was released. It flew straight and true, a dart of hope aimed at the narrow gap between the roaming cliffs. The rocks, sensing the intrusion, surged together with a sound like the world ending. Stone screamed against stone. The dove fluttered, a panicked heartbeat, and shot through the narrowing passage just as the cliffs met with a cataclysmic boom that sent a wall of water rushing back towards the Argo. The dove was safe, but a single, long tail feather was shorn from its body, floating down as the rocks began to slowly, agonizingly grind apart again. "Now!" Tiphys the helmsman screamed, his hands white on the tiller. "Row for your lives! Row as the dove flew!" 50 oars bit into the water as one. The Argo leaped forward, a wooden arrow shot towards the deadly gate. Atalanta, like all the others, pulled at her oar, her muscles burning, her world narrowing to the sweat in her eyes and the rhythmic, desperate heave. She could feel the terrible suction of the receding rocks, could hear the groan of the timbers as the ship was pulled towards the crushing impact. She looked up, her oar never breaking rhythm. She saw the cliffs, taller than any mountain she had known, rushing together. She saw the spray of water forced from the closing gap. She saw the single white feather spinning in the maelstrom of air. And in that moment, her hunter's instinct took over. She did not see an obstacle, she saw a path. The feather marked the exact center, the safest line. Left! she shouted, her voice cutting through the roar and the panting of the men. "Pull left! Follow the feather!" Tiphys, his vision obscured by spray, heard the absolute certainty in her cry. He wrenched the tiller, trusting the huntress's eyes. The Argo veered, its stern clearing the grinding stone by a hand's breadth. The sound of the collision was deafening, a physical blow that shook the ship to its keel. A shower of rock splinters, some as large as a man's head, rained down around them. But they were through. The clashing rocks, cheated of their prey, ground to a halt behind them, forever stilled by the passage of a successful ship. A collective gasp of relief, half sob, half cheer, went up from the crew. They had passed. They looked at Atalanta, not with the grudging respect of before, but with open awe. Her swift eyes had found a path where even the seer's dove had only shown the way. Weeks later, battered but unbroken, the Argo arrived in Colchis. The city of Ea was a place of alien splendor, its architecture strange and angular, its people dark-eyed and watchful. The palace of King Aeetes was a fortress of polished black stone, and the air around it smelled of strange incense and old power. This was the domain of the Golden Fleece, and its guardian, the king's daughter, the witch priestess Medea. While Jason and a delegation went to parley with the hostile, treacherous king, the rest of the crew waited under guard on the ship, tense and ready for a fight. It was here that Atalanta witnessed a different kind of power, one that chilled her far more than the clashing rocks. Medea came to the shore, drawn by curiosity to see the famous Greek heroes. She was a small, pale woman, draped in dark robes embroidered with silver sigils. Her beauty was sharp and unsettling, and her eyes held a knowledge that was ancient and terrible. She moved through the Argonauts, her gaze passing over the mighty Hercules, the noble Castor, the swift Idas. It was a gaze that weighed and found wanting. Then her eyes fell upon Atalanta. The two women stood apart from the ring of muscular men, two different kinds of outsiders. Medea's gaze was not one of suspicion or curiosity, but of recognition. She saw in Atalanta a similar refusal to be bound by the world's expectations, a similar harnessing of a power that men feared and did not understand. But where Atalanta's power was of the earth, physical, instinctual, pure, Medea's was of the mind, of the spirit, a dark, cultivated art. Medea approached her. The Argonauts fell back, superstitious fear making them give the witch a wide berth. "You are not like them," Medea said, her voice a low, melodic hum that seemed to vibrate in the bones. "I am myself," Atalanta replied, her own voice steady, though she felt the prickle of the other woman's power like a static charge on her skin. "They use you," Medea stated, her dark eyes seeing everything. "They use your eyes, your speed, your wildness, but they will never see you as their equal. To them, you will always be the exception that proves their rule." Atalanta said nothing. The words found an echo in the deepest, most private part of her soul. "I know what it is," Medea continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, "to be the most powerful person in the room, and yet be treated as a possession, a tool, a prize." A shadow of profound bitterness crossed her face. "My father sees me thus. Jason, he will see me thus. We are weapons, you and I, but a weapon can choose its target." She reached out, not to touch Atalanta, but to gesture towards the dark, wooded slopes that rose behind the city. "Your power is there, in the wild. Do not let them tame you. Do not let them chain you to their purposes, or you will end as I fear I must, burning my own world to the ground for a love that will never see me as anything more than useful." The warning hung between them, a prophecy and a curse. Then Medea turned and glided back towards the palace, leaving Atalanta with a cold knot of foreboding in her stomach. She had faced monsters and clashing rocks, but the witch's words were the most dangerous thing she had encountered. They were a poison that could make her doubt her place, her purpose. She looked at the Argo, at the heroes who were now her comrades, and for the first time, she wondered if Medea was right. Was she just a tool? A well-trained hound for a pack that would never truly accept her? The quest for the fleece was nearing its end, but a new, more personal struggle was just beginning. The Field of Ares. The atmosphere in the Colchian royal court was thick enough to choke on, a potent mixture of hostility, suspicion, and the cloying sweetness of Medea's magical perfumes. King Aeetes, a monarch whose face was a mask of avarice and cruel intelligence, had no intention of simply handing over the golden fleece. He set Jason an impossible task, a trial designed to be a death sentence. "You wish for the fleece?" he had sneered, his voice echoing in the torchlit hall. "Then you must prove yourself worthy. You will yoke my 2 bronze-hooved, fire-breathing bulls to a plow. You will plow the field of Ares, and you will sow the furrows not with grain, but with the teeth of a dragon. From these teeth will spring a legion of armed warriors, born from the earth, and you must defeat them all, single-handed." Despair gripped the Argonauts. This was not a feat of heroism. It was sorcery. No mortal man could withstand fire-breathing bulls or an army sprung from the soil. Jason, his face pale, returned to the ship, the weight of certain doom upon his shoulders. It was then that the power Medea had spoken of made itself known. Under the cover of a moonless night, the witch priestess came to him. Driven by the capricious will of the gods and a burgeoning, desperate passion for the handsome foreign prince, she offered him a deal. She would give him the charms and potions to survive the trials. In return, he would swear a sacred oath to take her with him when he left, to make her his wife. The crew listened to this plan with a mixture of hope and profound unease. To rely on a woman's witchcraft felt dishonorable to many, a stain on their heroic quest. But what choice did they have? Atala watched the proceedings from the shadows of the deck, Medea's warning echoing in her mind. "They will never see you us their equal. To them, you will always be the exception that proves their rule." She saw the way Jason looked at Medea, not with love, but with a calculating need. He saw her power as a key, just as the others saw Atala's speed as a tool. The similarity was unsettling. The next day, the entire population of Colchis and the crew of the Argo gathered on the edge of the Field of Ares, a vast barren plain of hard-baked clay. The air shimmered with heat and anticipation. At one end stood the 2 bulls, creatures of living bronze, whose hooves struck sparks from the ground and whose nostrils billowed clouds of sulphurous smoke. They were tethered to the adamant plow, a monstrous, unadorned piece of machinery that looked heavy enough to anchor a mountain. Jason stepped onto the field, anointed with Medea's protective salve. He looked small and terribly mortal. A collective gasp went up as he approached the bulls. They lowered their heads, their bronze horns gleaming, and charged, fire erupting from their maws in a continuous roaring stream. But the fire parted around him, the salve creating an invisible shield. The heroes cheered. Jason, emboldened, grabbed the bulls by their horns. Medea's magic flowed through him, granting him a superhuman strength. With a grunt of effort that was heard across the field, he forced their heads down, bending their necks, and yoked them to the plow. The sight was unbelievable. The bronze bulls, subdued, began to plow. The adamant share cut into the hard earth, turning over deep, dark furrows. Atalanta watched, her hunter's eyes missing nothing. She saw the strain on Jason's face, the way the magic was a borrowed force, not his own. This was not a victory of skill or courage, it was a transaction. When the field was plowed, Jason took the bag of dragon's teeth from a trembling priest and began to sow them, casting the yellowed, venomous-looking fangs into the fresh furrows. He had barely finished when the ground began to stir. It bulged and shifted, and then, with a sound like tearing linen, the soil split open. From every furrow, a fully armed warrior sprang forth, born from the earth, his body made of clay and fury, his eyes glowing with a malevolent green light. Within moments, a full phalanx of hundreds of these Spartoi, the sown men, stood shoulder to shoulder, their bronze spear points forming a glittering, impenetrable wall. They leveled their spears and began to advance us, one, a silent, terrifying tide of destruction. Panic seized the Argonauts. This was the end. No potion could protect Jason from this. But Jason remembered the second part of Medea's advice. As the earthborn army marched towards him, he took a heavy lump of rock Medea had given him and hurled it into the very center of their ranks. The effect was instantaneous and chaotic. The rock, a simple stone, became the ultimate prize. The Spartoi, their simple, warlike minds unable to comprehend the trick, turned on each other. The warrior nearest the stone believed his neighbor was trying to steal his trophy. He drove his spear into his fellow's chest. In a heartbeat, the perfect formation dissolved into a brutal, internecine battle. They fought with a mindless ferocity, clay bodies shattering, green light extinguished as they fell, returning to the earth from which they had sprung. It was a slaughter, but Jason was not the agent of it. He was merely the instigator, standing safely to the side while the monsters destroyed themselves. Within minutes, the field of Ares was littered with broken shards of clay and discarded weapons. Not a single sown man remained standing. A tense silence fell over the field, followed by a ragged, disbelieving cheer from the Argonauts. They had won. The task was complete. But Atalanta felt no joy, only a cold hollow in the pit of her stomach. She had come on this quest for the purity of the challenge, to test her skills against the impossible. What she had witnessed was not a hero's triumph, but a puppet show. Jason had been a marionette, his strings pulled by a witch's power. The victory felt cheap, sullied, a thing of trickery and deceit. It was the very opposite of the clean, honest kill of the hunt. King Aeetes was furious, his face a thundercloud of betrayed rage. He had been cheated of his prize and his revenge. He stormed from the field, his guards following, vowing terrible retribution. That night, us, the Argonauts, celebrated their hollow victory. The air aboard the Argo was electric with a different kind of tension. They had the king's enmity, and they still did not have the fleece. Jason's debt to Medea was now absolute. The quest had descended from a heroic epic into a sordid tale of betrayal and stolen power. Atalanta looked out at the dark, hostile city, then at the celebrating men, and she knew Medea had been right. This was not her world. The true test was no longer in the field of battle, but in navigating the treacherous currents of the human heart, a terrain for which she had no map. The golden prize and the bitter flight. The celebration aboard the Argo was a nervous, fleeting thing, a spark of light quickly swallowed by the oppressive darkness of the Colchian night and the looming shadow of King Aeetes' wrath. They had fulfilled the task, but the fleece was not yet theirs. It hung in the sacred grove of Eris, guarded not only by the great unsleeping dragon, but by the king's entire army, now doubly alert and enraged. Jason, his face drawn with exhaustion and the lingering shock of his survival, convened the heroes in a hushed council on the deck. The plan he proposed was not one of heroic assault, but of theft. Medea, bound to him now by his oath and her own desperate actions, would drug the guardian dragon. Under cover of her magic, Jason would sneak into the grove and take the prize. To many of the Argonauts, this was the final indignity. To steal a prize they had, in their eyes, earned was one thing. To rely so completely on a foreign witch's treachery was another. Grumbling spread through the crew, but the alternative, a direct assault on the Colchian fortress, was suicide. They were trapped by their own success. Atalanta listened in silence. The entire enterprise had lost its luster. The quest for the Golden Fleece, a symbol of kingship and divine favor, had been reduced to a sordid burglary. She thought of the clean, sunlit forests of Arcadia, the honest pursuit of prey, the simple, uncomplicated world she understood. Here, everything was layered with deceit. In the dead of night, Jason and Medea slipped away from the ship. The crew waited, every nerve stretched taut. The silence was a physical pressure. Atalanta stood at the rail, her eyes scanning the black silhouette of the city, her ears straining for the first shout of alarm. Time stretched, thin and brittle. Then they saw it, a flicker of movement from the direction of the sacred grove. Two figures running, and in Jason's arms, a bundle that seemed to capture the very essence of moonlight. It was the fleece. Even from a distance, its radiance was breathtaking. It was not merely gold, it was living light, a captured dawn. Its fleece so brilliant it illuminated their path, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to flee with them. A collective held breath was released. They had it. But the triumph was short-lived. From the palace walls, a horn blared, a raw, angry sound that ripped through the night. Then another and another. Torches flared to life along the battlements, swarming like angry fireflies. Aeetes had discovered the theft. The pursuit was on. "To your oars!" Jason shouted, his voice cracking with adrenaline as he and Medea scrambled aboard, the fleece tumbling onto the deck where it lay, pulsing with a soft, unearthly glow. "Row! Row for the mouth of the river!" Chaos erupted. The Argo was untied, its sail unfurled. The oars, clumsy in the panic, splashed into the water. The ship began to move, but it was slow, so slow. Behind them, the Colchian fleet, a dark swarm of smaller, faster galleys, was being launched, their oars moving with the practiced rhythm of a military machine. The race for the open sea began. The Argo, heavy with 50 men and its priceless cargo, was a lumbering giant compared to the sleek Colchian pursuit ships. Arrows began to fall around them, hissing into the water like venomous snakes. One thudded into the mast, its shaft vibrating. Atalanta moved without being told. This was a hunt, but now the roles were reversed. They were the prey. She snatched up her bow and quiver and climbed onto the raised stern platform, a position that gave her a commanding view of the pursuing fleet. The other archers aboard, Philoctetes, a few others, joined her, but their shots were hopeful, aimed into the mass of ships. Atalanta's were surgical. She became an extension of the ship itself, a stinging wasp at its tail. She ignored the shouting, the panic, the terrifying glow of the fleece at her feet. Her world narrowed to the leading Colchian galley, to the helmsman standing at its stern, guiding it. She drew, breathed, and released. The arrow flew true, a silver streak in the mixed light of the moon and the fleece. It took the helmsman in the throat. The galley immediately veered, its oars fouling with the ship next to it, creating a chaotic tangle that slowed the entire front line. A cheer went up from the Argonauts. She notched another arrow. She targeted the rowers, not to kill, but to maim, to disrupt the rhythm. Her arrows found shoulders, arms, the wood of the oars themselves, splintering them. Each shot was a calculated act of sabotage. She was not trying to sink the ships, she was trying to break their spirit, to make the pursuit too costly. One by one, the leading galleys fell back, their decks littered with wounded, their oar strokes becoming erratic. The Colchian captains, seeing their best ships being systematically disabled by a single unerring archer, began to hesitate. The clear path to the lumbering Argo was becoming a gauntlet of pain. Meanwhile, Medea stood at the prow, her hands raised to the sky. She began to chant in a low, guttural tongue, her voice weaving a spell into the fabric of the night. A thick, unnatural fog began to boil up from the surface of the river, a clinging, gray blindness that swallowed the pursuing fleet. The shouts of the Colchians turned from anger to confusion and then to terror as they lost sight of their quarry and each other in the magical murk. Between Atalanta's deadly precision and Medea's sorcerous veil, the Argo broke free into the open sea. The sounds of pursuit faded behind them, lost in the fog and the night. Alayhi salam, when the first light of dawn tinged the horizon, the crew collapsed at their oars, exhausted but alive. They had the fleece. They had escaped. But the mood was not celebratory. They looked at the glowing prize in their midst, then at the witch who had secured it, and then at the huntress whose arrows had cleared their path. The two women stood at opposite ends of the ship, one shrouded in dark magic, the other in the quiet competence of the wild. They had saved the quest, but they had also exposed the fragile nature of the hero's glory. The golden fleece was theirs, but the price had been a piece of their honor, and the victory belonged as much to the outcast women as it did to the legendary men. The journey home would be long, and the memory of this bitter flight would hang over them, a gleaming, golden shame. The return to a changed world. The voyage home was a mirror of the outgoing journey, but its reflection was distorted, tinged with a weariness that seeped into the ship's very timbers. The golden fleece, stowed carefully in a chest to dampen its unearthly radiance, was less a trophy and more a burden, a constant, gleaming reminder of the deceit and sorcery that had secured it. The easy camaraderie that had characterized the Argo's initial voyage was gone, replaced by a strained silence, broken only by the necessary commands of sailing and the ever-present, low, venomous whispers directed at Medea. The witch priestess kept to herself, a small, dark figure huddled near the mast, her eyes holding a defiant, fearful glare. Jason was bound to her by his oath, but he avoided her gaze, the memory of his dependency a canker on his pride. The crew hated her not as a savior, but as a curse, a living embodiment of the dishonor that tainted their prize. Only Atalanta regarded her with something akin to understanding, a shared, unspoken bond of being instrumental yet ostracized. For Atalanta, the wide expanse of the sea offered a bleak kind of peace. The challenges were now elemental, navigating storms, foraging on strange shores, surviving. These were tasks her body and spirit understood. She resumed her role as scout and hunter, her arrows providing sustenance when their supplies ran low on the long, circuitous route home. A route chosen to avoid the vengeance of Aeetes' fleet. She was valued again, in the simple, practical way a sharp knife or a full water skin is valued. It was a transaction she could comprehend, far removed from the complex, toxic debts that bound Jason and Medea. When the familiar, sun-baked hills of the Peloponnese finally rose from the sea, a collective sigh of relief passed through the crew. They were home. But Atalanta felt a peculiar tightening in her chest. The world she was returning to was the same, yet she was not. She had seen the edge of the earth, witnessed sorcery, and fought not just beasts, but the very nature of heroism itself. The forests of Arcadia, which had once felt like the entire world, now seemed like a small, quiet room. The reception in Iolcos was triumphant, but to Atalanta's sharpened senses, it felt hollow. The people cheered the return of the Argo. They marveled at the unveiled fleece. They sang songs of Jason's name. The complexities of the quest, the clashing rocks, the fire-breathing bulls, the sown men, were smoothed into a streamlined narrative of glorious conquest. The roles of Medea's magic and Atalanta's crucial archery during the escape were minimized, footnotes in the grand saga of Jason's leadership. She stood at the edge of the celebrating throng, watching. She saw Jason wearing a crown of laurels, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. She saw Medea standing slightly behind him, her face a mask of isolated pride, already sensing the fickleness of the adoration. The heroes, Hercules, Castor, Pollux, were embraced, their legends burnished. They had returned to their places in the world. Atalanta felt no such pull. The celebrations, the feasts, the speeches, it was all a noisy, meaningless ritual. She had gotten what she wanted from the voyage, the test, the proof of her own capability against the most extreme challenges the world could offer. The approval of kings and crowds was a stale, unsatisfying prize. After a few days, she sought out Rhoetus and Alara, who had traveled to Iolcos upon hearing news of the Argo's return. The reunion was warm, filled with a quiet, profound relief. Alara hugged her fiercely, her tears wetting Atalanta's tunic. Rhoetus simply placed a calloused hand on her shoulder, his eyes shining with an emotion too deep for words. They saw the change in her, the new layers of experience in her gaze, the hardened resolve in her posture. "It is over," Alara said, stroking her hair. "You are home. You can rest now." But Atalanta shook her head. "I am home," she said, her voice soft but firm, "but I cannot rest, not here." She looked towards the mountains, visible as a purple haze on the horizon. The court of Iolcos, with its politics and its perfumed lies, was a cage. The true world, the world of wind and leaf and stone, was calling her back. The voyage had not quenched her thirst for the wild. It had confirmed it as her only true home. She took her leave of Jason and the Argonauts. Their farewells were respectful, but distant. They were returning to their kingdoms, their wives, their destinies as rulers and legends. She was returning to the forest. They were parting ways at a crossroads, their shared journey already receding into the past, a story to be told in separate tongues. Eliasalem, she, Rhoetus, and Alara began the journey back to Arcadia. Atalanta felt the weight of the civilized world lift from her shoulders with every step. The air grew cleaner, the sounds more natural. She was carrying something back with her, however, not gold or glory, but a hard-won certainty. She had ventured into the world of men and heroes and found it wanting. Their glory was a fragile thing, built on oaths that could be broken and victories that could be stolen. She had a new legend attached to her name now, that of an Argonaut. But to her, it was not the defining chapter of her life. It was an interlude, a long, strange hunt that had taught her the most valuable lesson all, that her freedom, her own self-sufficient existence, was the only prize worth having. The world was changed because she had changed, and she knew with every fiber of her being that she would defend that hard-won freedom with the same ferocity with which she had once faced the Caledonian boar. The sanctuary of the unwilling bride. The return to Arcadia was a homecoming to the self. The dense, familiar forests of Mount Parthenion enveloped Atalanta like a second skin, their scent of pine resin and damp earth a balm to her spirit after the salt and intrigue of the long voyage. The village welcomed her back with a renewed, deeper awe. She was no longer just the bear girl or the local huntress, but she was Atalanta the Argonaut, a figure who had walked among demigods and faced wonders beyond their imagining. This fame, however, brought with it an unwelcome and escalating problem. She was now a woman of marriageable age, and her legendary status made her a prize beyond any boar's hide or golden fleece. Suitors began to arrive. At first, they were local princes and lords from neighboring city-states, drawn by the fame and the challenge she represented. They came with boasts of their lineage, their wealth, their strength. They found not a simpering maiden, but a woman who would meet them at the edge of the forest, her bow in her hand, and assess them with the same dispassionate eye she would a stag. "I have no need of a husband," she would tell them, her voice flat and final. "My life is my own." Most left, their pride wounded, muttering about her unnaturalness. But us the tales of her beauty, a wild, fierce beauty that was us compelling, us it was intimidating, spread. The suitors became more persistent, more powerful. Kings from distant lands sent emissaries. The pressure mounted, a constant, buzzing annoyance that began to encroach upon her hard-won peace. Rhoetus and Ilara, while protective, also felt the weight of tradition. "A woman must marry, Atalanta," Ilara would plead gently, "to have a home, a family, protection." "I have a home," Atalanta would reply, gesturing to the forested slopes. "The sky is my roof, the nymphs and the beasts are my family, and I am my own protection." She saw the institution of marriage for what it was in her world, a transfer of ownership, a taming, a chain that would bind her to a hearth and the will of a man. It was a fate worse than any death she could imagine on a hunt. The memory of Medea, bound to a man who already resented his debt to her, served us a chilling cautionary tale. The final, unbearable straw was the arrival of a suitor from Mycenae, a coarse, bullish man named Idas, who had been a fellow Argonaut. He did not come with polite emissaries, but with a band of armed retainers, and he demanded her hand us as if it were a right owed to him for their shared past. "We faced the clashing rocks together, girl," he declared, his chest puffed out. "That makes us kin of a sort. It is time you put aside this childishness and became a proper wife. My house is strong. You will want for nothing." Atalanta stood on the porch of Rhoetus's home, her arms crossed. "I want for nothing now," she said, her voice cold, "and I am not a prize to be claimed from a shared journey. Leave." Idas's face darkened. "No woman speaks to me thus. Your foster father will see reason, or he will see the point of my spear." It was in that moment, facing the threat of forced betrothal and the endless, escalating stream of men who saw her as a conquest, that Atalanta made a decision. She would not be a passive object to be fought over. She would not allow her life to be dictated by the desires of others. She needed a sanctuary, a statement so absolute it would silence all suitors forever. She went to the Temple of Artemis, high on a secluded mountainside, a place of simple, rugged stone open to the sky. She knelt before the ancient, weathered statue of the goddess, her bow laid at its feet. The air was thin and cold, scented only with wild thyme and the faint, clean smell of ozone. "Mistress of the wild," she prayed, her voice steady and clear, carrying on the wind. "Goddess of the hunt, protector of those who live unbounded, I have served you all my life, in spirit and in truth. I have asked for nothing. I ask now. Grant me your protection. Grant me the right to remain us as I am, free, unwed, my own. I vow to you, I shall never yield my virginity to any man. My body is my own, consecrated to the chase, to the wild, to you. Let any man who seeks to claim me face not my father's judgment, but your wrath. I am yours, Artemis. Let the world know it. It was not a plea. It was a declaration of allegiance, a forging of a final, unbreakable bond. As she spoke the words, a profound sense of rightness settled over her. It was the final piece of her identity clicking into place. She was not merely Atalanta the huntress or Atalanta the Argonaut. She was Atalanta, the eternal virgin, the mortal embodiment of Artemis's own will. A strange quiet fell over the grove. The wind stilled. A single sunlit beam broke through the clouds, illuminating the statue, and for a fleeting moment, the stone eyes seemed to gleam with approval. When she descended the mountain and returned to the village, she was transformed. The uncertainty was gone from her bearing, replaced by an imperious, divine certainty. When the next suitor arrived, a prince from Elis, she did not merely refuse him. I am sworn to Artemis, she announced, her voice carrying a new, terrifying authority. My vow is eternal. To pursue me is to defy the goddess. The price for your insistence will be your life. The prince, a pious man, paled and retreated, making frantic signs to ward off divine anger. The news spread like wildfire. Atalanta was no longer just an unwilling bride. She was a sacred object, a priestess of the untamable. The suitors did not stop coming entirely. There were always men arrogant enough to believe they could trump the will of a goddess, but the nature of their pursuit changed. It was no longer a simple matter of winning a father's consent. It became a direct challenge to a divine power. She had built her own sanctuary, not of stone and timber, but of vow and will. She had traded the potential for a mortal family for an eternal kinship with the wild. She was free, and she had placed the wrath of heaven between herself and any man who dared to think otherwise. The hunt for her hand had become the most dangerous game in all of Greece, the oracle's ultimatum. The vow to Artemis acted as a divine shield, a boundary as real and formidable as a wall of fire. For a time, the stream of suitors slowed to a trickle, then ceased altogether. The word had spread across the Peloponnese and beyond. The Arcadian huntress was not merely unwilling, she was consecrated, and to pursue her was to invite a celestial death. Atalanta luxuriated in this hard-won peace. Her days were once again her own, measured by the sun's arc and the tracks of game. Her nights spent under a canopy of stars, the forest sounds her only conversation. She believed the matter settled, her life's path finally, irrevocably clear. But the fates, it seemed, were not yet done spinning her thread. The peace was shattered not by a new suitor, but by a summons. A royal herald, this time from her own birthplace, Tegea, arrived at Rhoetas' door. His message was grave, his demeanor somber. King Iasus, her biological father, demanded her presence. A cold dread, a feeling she had not known since the Caledonian hunt, coiled in Atalanta's stomach. The man who had ordered her exposed on a mountainside now summoned her. Why? Rhoetas and Alara exchanged worried glances. This could not be a fatherly reunion. It was a political calculation. With a sense of grim inevitability, Atalanta agreed to go. She would not go as a supplicant daughter, but as the person she had become. She wore her best deerskin tunic, her bow slung across her back, her hair braided with a severity that was both practical and defiant. She walked into the palace at Tegea, a place of painted murals and polished stone that felt alien and suffocating. The courtiers stared, their whispers a hissing undercurrent of judgment and curiosity. King Iasus sat on a throne of carved cedar wood. He was an older man now, his hair streaked with gray, his face lined with the cares of rule, but his eyes held the same flinty calculation she remembered from the stories of her infancy. He looked at her, and she saw no warmth, no paternal recognition, only an assessment of an asset. "Atalanta," he began, his voice echoing in the hall. "The gods have preserved you, it seems. They have made you formidable." She said nothing, merely held his gaze, her posture unwavering. "Your fame has spread far," he continued, a note of irritation creeping into her tone at her silence. "But fame is a double-edged sword. Your refusal to marry, this vow to Artemis, it has become a problem." "It is my life," she stated, her voice clear and flat. "It is an insult," Iasus snapped, his composure cracking. "Kings and princes, powerful allies, are offended. They see your refusal not as piety, but as arrogance. Your defiance reflects poorly on me, on my house. It makes me look weak, unable to control my own blood." So that was it. It was not about her happiness or her destiny. It was about his pride, his political standing. She was an embarrassment, a loose thread in the tapestry of his kingship. "I am not yours to control," Atalanta replied, her voice dangerously quiet. "You relinquished that right on the day you left me for dead." A murmur ran through the court. Iasus's face flushed with anger. "I will not have my legacy threatened by a willful girl. You will marry. I have chosen a husband for you, a prince from Messenia. The alliance will be no." The single word hung in the air, final and absolute. Iasus looked as if he had been struck. No one, least of all a woman, spoke to a king in such a manner. Before he could erupt, the high priest of the local temple of Apollo stepped forward, an old man with eyes that salala beyond the moment. "My king," he interjected, his voice a combing rasp. "A direct command may provoke the wrath of Artemis. There is another way. Let us consult the oracle." The suggestion brought a tense silence. The oracle at Delphi spoke for the gods themselves. Its word was law. Iasus, seeing a path to enforce his will without appearing the tyrant, nodded curtly. "So be it. We shall go to Delphi. The Pythia will settle this." The journey to the sanctuary of Delphi was a pilgrimage into the heart of divine mystery. The path wound up the sacred slopes of Mount Parnassus through a landscape of breathtaking beauty and profound solemnity. The very air seemed charged with power, thin and sharp, smelling of rock, incense, and the faint, sickly sweet odor of the bay leaves the oracle chewed. Atalanta walked not in fear, but with a resolute heart. She trusted in her vow, in her connection to Artemis. Surely, the gods would uphold the sanctity of an oath made to one of their own. They entered the inner sanctum, a dark, cavernous chamber deep within the temple. The air was thick with the smoke of burning barley and laurel, making the single shaft of sunlight from above seem like a solid pillar of gold. In the center, seated on a tripod straddling a fissure in the rock from which intoxicating vapors rose, was the Pythia. She was an ordinary-looking woman, but her eyes were rolled back in her head, showing only the whites, and her body trembled with a violent, unnatural energy. The high priest posed the question to the writhing priestess. What is the will of the gods for the maiden Atalanta, daughter of Iasus? Must she uphold her vow to Artemis, or must she bow to her father's will and marry? A long, guttural moan escaped the Pythia's lips, a sound not entirely human. Her head lolled, and then she spoke, her voice a distorted chorus, as if multiple entities were speaking through her at once. The wild doe runs free, but even the stag is bound by the seasons. A daughter's vow is strong, but a father's line must not wither. Hear the will of Apollo. Atalanta shall indeed wed. A cold fist clenched around Atalanta's heart. Despair, black and absolute, threatened to swallow her. But the oracle was not finished. When a suitor emerges who can outrun her in a foot race, let the swiftest claim the swift, but defeat carries a grave price. Any man who challenges the huntress and loses shall pay for his audacity with his life. His blood will soak the earth, a tribute to the goddess he defied. So is the balance struck. The voice trailed off into a whimper, and the Pythia slumped, spent. In the ringing silence that followed, Atalanta's despair transformed. It did not become joy, but a fierce, defiant hope. The oracle had not broken her vow. It had weaponized it. She would not be given away like a trinket. She would be won only by a man who could surpass her in the one thing that defined her, her speed. And the cost of failure was death. It was a brutal, terrifying solution, but it was a solution that played to her strength. It was a hunt, the ultimate hunt, where she was both the quarry and the judge. King Iasus was displeased but bound by the divine decree. He could not simply marry her off. He had to arrange the race. He saw it as a delay, but one that would inevitably end in a marriage, for who could possibly be faster than his daughter? Atalanta looked at her father, a grim, determined light in her eyes. He thought this was a path to taming her. She knew it was a path to her freedom, paved with the bones of arrogant men. The oracle had not issued an ultimatum to her. It had issued one to the world. Let them come, let them try, and let them pay the price for their greed. The race was on. The Stadium of Fate. News of the oracle's decree spread across Greece with the speed of a forest fire. It was a sensation, a divine drama that captured the imagination of the entire land. The swift-footed huntress, the Argonaut, the slayer of the Caledonian boar spirit, was to be won in a foot race. The prize was unparalleled, a legendary beauty, a woman of mythic stature, and an alliance with the house of Tegea. The price of failure was absolute, a public, ignominious death. In the groves of Arcadia, Atalanta prepared. Her training was no longer for the hunt, but for the stadium. The race was to be a stadion, a single length of the course, roughly 200 paces. A short, explosive test of pure, unadulterated speed. She ran until her lungs felt like they would burst, her feet pounding the earth in a rhythm that was both prayer and defiance. She ran along the riverbanks, through the meadows, her body a study in focused motion. She was not just running. She was honing herself into a single, perfect instrument of velocity. The memory of every suitor's arrogant face, every king's entitled demand, fueled her. Each stride was a rejection of the fate they sought to impose upon her. King Iasus, seeing the spectacle as a way to enhance his own prestige, ordered the construction of a magnificent stadium on the plains outside Tegea. It was a grand arena with earthen banks for spectators and a starting line of polished white marble. The finishing post was a simple, stark wooden stake. On the day of the first race, the atmosphere was a volatile mixture of festival and execution. Vendors sold roasted meats and wine, bards sang of past heroes, and the air buzzed with a morbid, thrilling anticipation. The first suitor was a prince from a northern tribe, a man renowned for his prowess in the games. He was tall, muscular, and brimming with confidence. He strutted at the starting line, flexing his limbs, offering Atalanta a condescending smile. "Do not worry, little huntress," he boasted. "I will be gentle when I win." Atalanta stood beside him, her body relaxed, her gaze fixed on the distant post. She wore a short, simple chiton that allowed for maximum movement. She said nothing. The signal was given. The prince exploded from the line with powerful, grunting strides. The crowd roared. For the first 10 paces, he was ahead, his raw power giving him an initial burst. But Atalanta's start was different. It was not a burst, but an unleashing. She was like an arrow loosed from a bow, her motion fluid, efficient, her feet seeming to kiss the earth rather than pound it. By the 20-pace mark, she had drawn even. By the 40-pace mark, she was a full stride ahead. A disbelieving silence fell over the crowd. They were witnessing something unnatural. Her speed was not that of a trained athlete. It was the speed of a spirit, a force of nature. She did not look like she was straining. She looked like she was flying. The prince, hearing only her light, rapid footfalls and the roar of the blood in his own ears, realized with dawning horror that he was losing. He pushed harder, his face contorting with effort, his breath coming in ragged gasps. It was no use. Atalanta crossed the finish line, her chest barely heaving. She turned to watch the prince finish, his body sagging in defeat. The silence in the stadium was broken by the grim approach of the royal guards. The terms were absolute. The prince looked up, his face a mask of terror, his bravado gone. He was dragged away, his pleas for mercy echoing briefly before being silenced forever. The festive atmosphere was extinguished. The reality of the oracle's price had been paid. The crowd was sobered, shocked. But the line of suitors did not end. The allure of the prize was too great, the male ego too fragile. A second suitor came the next week, and then a third. Each was a celebrated runner. Each believed he was the exception. Each met the same fate. Atalanta raced them all, her speed unwavering, her focus absolute. The stadium's earth began to take on a dark, rusty hue near the executioner's block. The wooden finishing post began to look less like a goal and more like a grave marker. She became a figure of terrifying awe. Men no longer saw her just a beautiful woman. They saw her a scythe in human form. The races were no longer sporting events. They were rituals of death. The stadium outside Tegea became known as the Field of Hopes, a place where dreams of glory and love went to die, their lifeblood watering the soil. Atalanta ran, race after race, her freedom secured by a growing wall of corpses. She felt no pleasure in the killing, only a cold, grim satisfaction. This was the world men had made. This was the price they had set for her, and she would make them pay it, over and over again, until the message was seared into the consciousness of Greece. Atalanta was not to be owned. The golden apples. The grim harvest of the stadium continued, season after season. The initial trickle of boastful suitors became a sporadic, then a rare occurrence. The field of hopes lived up to its name only in the bitterest, most ironic sense. The dark stain near the executioner's block spread, a silent testament to the dozen or more young men who had gambled their lives and lost. Atalanta's name was now synonymous with both divine speed and a deadly, unapproachable purity. She was a locked temple, and the key was a feat no mortal man seemed to possess. In the quiet that followed, a fragile sense of normalcy returned to her life. She began to believe the message had been received. The world, it seemed, had finally learned to leave her alone. It was in this lull that a new suitor arrived in Tegea. His name was Hippomenes, a prince from the city of Onchestus. He did not come with a boisterous entourage or blustering boasts. He came alone, his demeanor thoughtful, his eyes holding not the lustful greed of his predecessors, but a deep, reverent admiration. He did not immediately demand a race. Instead, he presented himself at the palace, asking for an audience with King Iasius, not to claim his daughter, but to pay his respects. Iasius, weary of the entire bloody business, granted it. "You have seen the field?" the king asked, his voice tired. "You know the price?" "I have, your majesty," Hippomenes replied, his voice calm and steady. "And I know the prize. I do not come to conquer her, but to earn the right to stand beside her." Atalanta, who happened to be in the court, watched him from the shadows of a pillar. He was different. There was no arrogance in his posture, no sense of entitlement. He spoke of her not as an object to be won, but as a person to be understood. A strange, unfamiliar feeling stirred within her, not the cold defiance she was accustomed to, but a flicker of curiosity. Later, as she trained by the river, he found her. He did not interrupt, but stood at a distance, watching her run with an expression of pure awe, like a man witnessing a natural wonder. When she finally stopped, her skin glistening with sweat, he approached. "You move like thought itself," he said, his voice full of genuine wonder, "like light on water. It is a humbling thing to behold." Atalanta regarded him warily. "Flattery will not slow my feet when we race." "I do not intend it to," Hippomenes replied. "I intend only to speak the truth. I have heard the tales of the bear, of the centaurs, of the boar, of the Argo. You have lived a dozen lifetimes in one. To think a simple race could capture all that, it seems inadequate." His words disarmed her. No one had ever acknowledged the totality of her life before. To the others, she was a problem to be solved, a trophy to be claimed. To him, she seemed to be a story he wished to read. "Why would you risk death for a story?" she asked, her tone softer than she intended. "Because some stories are worth any risk," he said, meeting her gaze. "And because I have asked for help, not from my own strength, which I know is not enough, but from a higher power." He told her then. He had gone to the temple of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, whom Atalanta had so pointedly ignored in her devotion to Artemis. He had prayed not for victory, but for a chance. And the goddess, perhaps slighted by Atalanta's lifelong rejection of romance, had answered. She had given Hippomenes 3 golden apples from the sacred grove in the Hesperides, fruits of pure, irresistible enchantment. "My race will not be against you, Atalanta," Hippomenes said, his voice earnest. "It will be a race against my own cunning and the grace of a goddess. I do not ask you to slow down. I only ask that you run your truest race. The rest is in the hands of the gods." The day of the race dawned, clear and bright. The stadium was packed, the air electric with a tension that had been absent for months. The crowd had heard of the new, strange suitor and the rumor of divine intervention. This was not just another execution, it was a divine drama. Atalanta and Hippomenes stood at the white marble starting line. She was focused, her body coiled like a spring. He stood beside her, calm, holding 3 breathtakingly beautiful golden apples in a small pouch at his waist. Their radiance was palpable, casting a warm, honeyed light on the sand. The trumpets sounded. Atalanta launched herself forward, a streak of focused energy. Unsurprisingly, she immediately pulled ahead, her form perfect, her speed terrifying. The crowd began its usual grim murmur, anticipating the end. But Hippomenes did not despair. As Atalanta began to pull away, he took the first golden apple. He did not throw it ahead of her, he rolled it with a deft flick of his wrist so that it curved and bounced directly into her path. Atalanta saw the flash of gold from the corner of her eye. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. A ripple of distraction, the first she had ever felt in a race, went through her. The apple seemed to pulse with a life of its own, whispering of desire, of a beauty that was not of the hunt or the wild, but of something else entirely. It was a beauty to be possessed. Without fully understanding why, her pace faltered. She swerved, her hunter's instinct to seize a rare and wonderful thing overwhelming her runner's focus. In a fluid motion, she bent and scooped the apple from the sand. It was heavy, warm, perfect. The delay was only a heartbeat, but it was enough. Hippomenes, running with all his mortal might, surged past her. A gasp went through the crowd. She was behind. Atalanta's focus snapped back. Annoyance flared within her. She had been tricked, not by strength, but by seduction. She poured on the speed, her legs pumping, her breath even. Within moments, she was back at his shoulder, then began to pass him. Hippomenes, his lungs burning, threw the second apple. This time, he sent it farther to the side, a glinting temptation just off the ideal racing line. The same irresistible pull tugged at Atalanta. The desire to have that second apple, to complete the pair, was a physical ache. With a frustrated cry that was part snarl, part sigh, she broke her line again, darting to the side to retrieve it. The delay was longer this time. Hippomenes gained a crucial 3-stride lead. The finish post was terrifyingly close. Atalanta, clutching the 2 divine fruits, felt a panic she had never known. It was not the panic of losing her freedom, but the panic of being defeated by something she did not understand, by beauty, by desire. She dug deep into reserves of speed she did not know she possessed. She flew over the sand, closing the gap, her hand reaching out as the wooden post loomed. Hippomenes, with a final, desperate prayer, threw the last apple. He threw it directly ahead, but with a high arc so that it would land just short of the finish line. Atalanta saw it tumbled through the air, a miniature sun. It was the most powerful lure yet. To have all 3, the complete set, the perfect golden trinity. The desire was an agony. Her mind screamed at her to run, to win, to be free. But her heart, or some deeper, more primal part of her she had always suppressed, yearned for that apple. In that split second, suspended between destiny and desire, she made her choice. She leaped for the apple. Her fingers closed around its smooth, warm surface. As she landed and straightened, Hippomenes crossed the finish line. Silence. Absolute, profound silence. Then a roar that shook the stadium. Atalanta stood, panting, a golden apple in each hand. She looked at Hippomenes, who had collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, his face a mixture of exhaustion, disbelief, and triumph. She looked at the apples. She had not lost because he was faster. She had lost because she had wanted something else more than she wanted to win. Aphrodite, the goddess she had spurned, had not beaten Artemis. She had simply revealed a part of Atalanta that Artemis's wild domain could never satisfy. The guards did not approach. The terms had been met. She had been outrun. King Iasus smiled for the first time in years. Hippomenes rose and walked toward her, his hand outstretched, not to take the apples, but to her. Atalanta looked from his face to the golden apples, then back to his face. The race was over. She had lost her freedom. But as she looked into the eyes of the man who had won, not by overpowering her, but by understanding the secret language of desire, she wondered if, for the first time in her life, she had not lost something, but had instead chosen something else. A different kind of wilderness. The wedding of Atalanta and Hippomenes was the most celebrated event in a generation. King Iasus spared no expense, transforming the blood-stained field of hopes into a scene of opulent festivity. Garlands of flowers obscured the grim stain near the executioner's block, and the air, once thick with the tension of death, was now sweet with wine, roasting meat, and the melodies of a dozen lyres. The heroes of Greece came to witness the taming of the legendary huntress, to see the wild spirit finally bound by the sacred ties of marriage. Atalanta moved through the ceremonies like a woman in a dream. She wore a finely woven peplos of white, a delicate veil covering her famed chestnut hair. The traditional rites, the sacrifice to Hera, the joining of hands, the shared cake, felt like actions performed by another person. She was present, yet detached, watching herself from a great distance. The cheers of the crowd were a dull roar in her ears. When Hippomenes took her hand, his grip was firm and warm, his eyes shining with a love that was, to her, a bewildering foreign country. That night, in the bridal chamber strewn with petals, the final threshold awaited. The vow to Artemis, the core of her identity for so long, stood like a ghost in the room. To break it was to defy a goddess, to invite a wrath that could be terrible. Yet the oracle had decreed she would wed, and the race had been won under the auspices of Aphrodite. She was caught in a divine contradiction. Hippomenes did not approach her with the crude entitlement of a conqueror. He stood before her, his own nervousness evident. "Atalanta," he said softly, "I know the weight of the vow you made. I do not ask you to break it for me. I ask you to transform it. Artemis is the goddess of the moon, of the wild, but even the wild things mate. Even the moon does not shine alone. It reflects the light of the sun. Let this not be a surrender, but a new kind of hunt, a shared one." His words were not a command, but an invitation. He sallallahu alaihi wasallam, her, not us a prize to be unwrapped, but us a partner to be won anew, in a different arena. He respected the power of her vow, even as he asked her to transcend it. Atalanta looked at him, at the man who had seen the totality of her and had not been afraid, but had been inspired. He had not tried to overpower her speed. He had raced alongside it, adding a new dimension of cunning to her world. The fierce, defensive independence that had been her armor for so long began to soften, not out of weakness, but out of a dawning, terrifying curiosity. What would it be like to not always stand alone? What mysteries lay in this different kind of wilderness, the wilderness of the human heart, of shared vulnerability? Slowly, she reached up and unpinned her veil, letting it fall to the floor. Then she began to untie the fastenings of her own tunic, the simple, practical garment of the huntress. It was not an act of submission, but one of agency. She was choosing him, choosing the unknown over the known, the complex tapestry of a shared life over the simple, stark tapestry of a solitary one. When they came together, it was not a conquest, but a discovery. The familiar landscape of her body, which she knew only as an instrument of speed and strength, was mapped anew with a different kind of knowledge. The pleasure was a strange and powerful country, a terrain of sensation for which she had no words. It was a loss of control that felt, paradoxically, like a new form of power. The ghost of Artemis did not strike her down. Instead, she felt a strange release, as if the goddess, understanding the complexity of mortal paths, had loosened her claim. In the days and weeks that followed, Atalanta's life transformed. The relentless pursuit of the hunt was replaced by the intricate dance of a royal court. She was a princess now, expected to preside over feasts, to listen to petitions, to weave the social fabric of the palace. It was a cage, but Hippomenes did not lock the door. He walked with her through its corridors, explaining the politics, sharing the burdens, seeking her counsel. He valued her sharp mind as much as he adored her swift feet. They still hunted together, ranging through the forests of Arcadia as equals, a partnership that became the talk of Greece. He with his spear, she with her bow, a king and queen of the wild, their love forged in the crucible of a divine race. She taught him the silent language of the forest. He taught her the nuanced language of the human heart. Atalanta found that the world of emotion was a wilderness as vast and challenging as any she had known. The fierce joy she felt in Hippomenes' presence was a new kind of speed. The quiet contentment of shared silence was a new kind of stillness. The vulnerability of loving someone, of allowing her happiness to be tied to another, was the most dangerous hunt she had ever undertaken. She had not been tamed. She had been expanded. The vow to Artemis was not broken. It was fulfilled in a way she could never have anticipated. She had remained true to her wild spirit, but she had learned that the wild could also be found in the tangled, beautiful, terrifying landscape of love. She had exchanged one wilderness for another, and in doing so had discovered that her courage was not just for running alone, but also for standing together. The profanation. The rhythm of their life together settled into a harmony Atalanta had never imagined possible. The palace in Onchestus, once a place of foreign protocol, became a home, its halls echoing not just with political intrigue, but with shared laughter and quiet understanding. Hippomenes ruled with a just and thoughtful hand, and beside him, Atalanta found a new kind of power. Not the solitary power of the hunt, but the influential power of counsel and partnership. Their hunts together were legendary, a seamless fusion of his strategic mind and her preternatural instincts. They were the talk of Greece, the prince who had won the unwinnable race, and the huntress who had chosen to be one. Yet a shadow lingered at the edges of their happiness, a whisper of divine discontent. Atalanta had broken her vow to Artemis, and while no immediate lightning bolt had struck her down, the weight of that transgression was a cold stone in her gut. Hippomenes, sensing her unease, suggested a pilgrimage. They would travel to a remote, sacred grove of Zeus in the mountains, a place of immense power and sanctity, to make a sacrifice. It would be an act of thanksgiving to the king of the gods for their union, and perhaps a subtle plea for his protection against any lingering wrath from his daughter Artemis. The journey was a return to the world Atalanta loved most. They left their royal retinue behind, traveling with only a few trusted guards, the world narrowing to the path beneath their feet and the canopy overhead. The air grew cooler, thinner, as they climbed into the high, wild places where the scent of pine was sharp and clean. The grove, when they found it, was a place of breathtaking, primordial majesty. Great, ancient cypress trees towered into the sky, their trunks so thick that 3 men could not have encircled them. The silence was profound, broken only by the wind sighing through the needles, a sound like the very breath of the earth. In the center of the grove stood a rough-hewn altar of gray stone, darkened by the smoke of countless offerings. The vibe was one of deep, ancient peace. The atmosphere was charged with a sacred hush, a palpable sense that they were guests in a divine dwelling. Atalanta felt the familiar thrill of the wild, but it was tempered here with a reverence that made her want to whisper. This was not her artesian domain of chase and blood. This was the solemn throne room of the Father God. They prepared the sacrifice, a young, unblemished ram. The ritual was simple and powerful. Hippomenes kindled the sacred fire on the altar, the flames crackling brightly in the dim, greenish light of the grove. He offered the prayers, his voice steady and respectful, giving thanks for their union and asking for Zeus's continued favor. The smell of burning fat and barley cake, the savor, began to rise, the traditional offering to the gods. It was then, in the wake of the solemn prayer, surrounded by the immense, silent witnesses of the ancient trees, that the shift occurred. The profound peace of the grove, the very sanctity of the place, seemed to act as an intoxicant. The sheer joy of their escape from court, the raw beauty of the wild, the memory of their first union, it all coalesced into a wave of irresistible passion. The careful boundaries between the sacred and the profane, so diligently maintained by civilization, dissolved in that primeval place. Hippomenes looked at Atalanta, and the love and desire in his eyes were magnified by the powerful setting. She looked back, her own defenses gone, the huntress's primal energy merging with the wife's passion. The reverence for the grove became entangled with a fierce, celebratory joy for their lives. Without a word, drawn by a force stronger than piety or prudence, he took her hand. He led her away from the altar, its sacred fire still burning, to a soft patch of moss sheltered by the roots of the largest cypress. It was a place that seemed made for them, a natural bower within the holy precinct. Their coupling was not the tender discovery of their wedding night. It was fierce, joyful, a raw affirmation of life performed in the heart of the most sacred space. It was a celebration of the wildness in them both, a consummation of their love in the very bosom of nature. To them, in that moment, it felt like the most natural prayer they could offer. But they had forgotten the eyes of the gods are not human eyes. What felt to them like a harmonious union with the wild was, in the divine perspective, a blatant, shocking profanation. They had defiled the sacred grove of Zeus. They had turned a place of worship into a bedchamber. The very trees seemed to recoil. The gentle sigh of the wind stiffened into a cold, angry gust. The climax of their passion was met with a sudden, terrifying silence. The world froze. Then a presence filled the grove, a pressure so immense it felt like the sky was falling. It was not the nurturing presence of the wild they knew, but a judgmental, furious power. The air crackled with divine wrath. A voice, not heard with ears but felt in the marrow of their bones, echoed through the grove. It was the voice of Cybele, the Great Mother, or perhaps of Zeus himself, speaking through the sanctity of his desecrated domain. The words were simple, final, and utterly merciless. You have taken your joy in a place of awe. Now you shall be forever bound to it, a warning to all who would mock the sacred. A blinding flash, not of light, but of transformative power, engulfed them. Atalanta's cry of pleasure became a strangled roar. Hippomenes' loving embrace became a desperate clawing at his own changing flesh. Their human forms contorted, twisted, and melted under the relentless force of the divine punishment. Where Atalanta had stood, a powerful lioness now crouched, her tawny coat the color of her former hair, her eyes still holding a ghost of their human intelligence, now blazing with a feral confusion. Where Hippomenes had been, a massive lion shook his great mane, a roar of anguish and disorientation tearing from his throat. The grove was silent once more. The sacred fire on the altar flickered and died. The two lions, once a prince and a princess, looked at each other. A flicker of recognition passed between them. A love that had transcended one form, now trapped in another. But it was a love overshadowed by a bestial nature imposed upon them. They were mates, bound by the very act that had condemned them. But the sophisticated human love they had shared was buried deep beneath instinct and rage. They turned and padded away, two magnificent, tragic beasts, disappearing into the shadows of the grove they had defiled. They were together, us they had always wanted to be. But their union was now an eternal, roaming curse, a living testament to the price of forgetting that even for those who love the wild, there are boundaries even they cannot cross. The hunt was over. They had become the hunted, their spirits imprisoned in the very wilderness they had adored. The roaming curse. The world, which had once been a tapestry of nuanced sensation and complex emotion, was now a stark landscape of primal impulses. The sun was no longer a giver of life and warmth, but a measure of the hunt. The wind was not a carrier of distant songs or the scent of rain, but a messenger of prey and rival. For Atalanta, the consciousness that had been hers was now a flickering lamp trapped inside a storm of instinct. She could remember fragments like shards of a broken pot, the feel of a bow in her hand, the sound of Hippomenes' voice speaking her name, the crushing weight of the divine judgment. But these memories had no context, no emotional anchor. They were ghosts that flitted through a mind now ruled by hunger, territory, and the deep ingrained bond to the male lion who was her mate. They turned and padded away, two magnificent, tragic beasts, disappearing into the shadows of the grove they had defiled. They were together, us they had always wanted to be, but their union was now an eternal, roaming curse, a living testament to the price of forgetting that even for those who love the wild, there are boundaries even they cannot cross. The hunt was over. They had become the hunted, their spirits imprisoned in the very wilderness they had adored. The roaming curse. Hippomenes. She knew him. A scent, a presence, a rumbling purr that resonated in her very bones. When he was near, a semblance of peace settled over her fractured spirit. They hunted together, their coordination a brutal, efficient echo of their human partnership. She would drive the prey, her lioness body a masterpiece of stealth and explosive speed, a grim parody of her legendary foot races. He would make the kill, his powerful jaws and greater strength delivering the final, crushing blow. They ate together, the metallic taste of blood a constant reminder of the life they now lived. But the love, the tender, conscious love that had defined them, was inaccessible. It was a treasure locked in a sunken chest at the bottom of a raging sea. The bond they shared was powerful, feral, a product of the curse that had bound them together in this bestial form. They were mates, but the profound conversation of souls was gone, replaced by nudges, growls, and the simple, physical comfort of lying together in the sun. They became a legend of a different sort, the royal lions of the sacred grove. Shepherds would tell tales of seeing them, two magnificent beasts, larger and more noble than any ordinary lions, moving through the high forests of Arcadia. They were seen as omens, sometimes of drought, sometimes of war. No hunter dared pursue them. Their size and an uncanny, almost intelligent coordination made them seem invulnerable, touched by the gods. The very story of their transformation had spread, a cautionary tale whispered in temples and around fires, a story about the dangers of hubris, even the hubris of love. For Atalanta, trapped within the lioness, the greatest torment was the loss of her purpose. The hunt was no longer a test of skill or a means of sustenance. It was a biological imperative. The wind in her fur was not freedom. It was simply the air moving past. The endless roaming of their territory, a vast tract of mountain and forest, was not an adventure. It was a prison yard. She would sometimes find herself on a high cliff, looking out over the plains of Arcadia, and a wave of something akin to grief would wash over her, a deep, wordless longing for a self that was no longer there. Once, they encountered a party of hunters from Tegea. Atalanta smelled them long before she saw them, the scent of man, of sweat and leather and iron. A tremor of something old and complex ran through her. Hippomenes let out a low, warning growl, positioning himself between her and the approaching threat. The hunters salalavam. They froze, their faces etched with terror and awe. One of them, a young man, slowly lowered his spear, his eyes wide. "By the gods," he whispered, "it's true, the huntress and her prince." The words meant nothing to the lioness, but they struck a chord in the buried human consciousness within Atalanta. A flash of memory, a stadium, a cheering crowd, a golden apple. She took a step forward, a low rumble in her throat that was not entirely a threat. It was a question. The young hunter, misunderstanding, raised his spear again. In that moment, Hippomenes, protective and driven by the lion's instinct to defend his mate, charged. The scene dissolved into a chaos of shouting men, the roar of the lion, and the frantic flight of the hunters. No one was killed, but the message was clear. The boundary between the human world and their cursed existence was absolute and dangerous. As the years wore on, the human memories faded, becoming like the faintest of dreams upon waking. The lioness and the lion grew older, their coats growing thin in places, their movements losing a fraction of their former grace. The bond between them remained, the one constant in their cursed existence. They were forever together, yet forever alone, two royal spirits pacing out their sentence in the silent green cathedral of the wilderness. Their legacy was a double-edged sword. To the people of Greece, Atalanta was remembered as the swift-footed heroine, the Argonaut, the woman who defined her own destiny until a moment of passion undid it all. But in the deep forests, another legacy lived on, the legend of the two great lions, a roaming curse and a timeless warning. They were a testament to the fact that the gods' gifts of speed, of love, of wildness could be taken away in a heartbeat, transformed into the very chains that bound you. The fierce huntress had finally been captured, not by a man, but by a fate far crueler than any she could have ever imagined. Her final race was over, and she had lost everything, except the one thing the curse had forced upon her, the constant, beastly presence of the man she had chosen to love. The fading roar. Time, which had once been measured in seasons of the hunt and the turning of political fortunes, now moved to the slower, more brutal rhythm of decay. The magnificent lions, once the terror and wonder of the Arcadian highlands, were entering their twilight. Hippomenes's great mane was now streaked with coarse, wiry gray, and a permanent stiffness had settled into his once powerful shoulders. Atalanta, the lioness, moved with a careful, deliberate grace, a faint, persistent ache in her hips a constant companion. The explosive speed that had defined her, first as a woman and then as a predator, was a fading memory in her muscles. Their territory, which they had once patrolled with relentless vigilance, had shrunk, confined now to the most secluded valleys and the most inaccessible cliffs around the very sacred grove that had been their undoing. The world, through their eyes, was becoming softer, less sharply defined. Scents were not as vibrant, sounds not as clear. The primeval fire of instinct that had burned so brightly in their prime was banked to a lower, warmer glow. And in this quieting of their animal selves, the ghosts of their past began to stir from their long slumber. It happened on a day when the autumn sun was weak and golden, slanting through the yellowing leaves of the oak trees. They were lying together on a sun-warmed rock overlooking a familiar valley, a place that, in another life, Atalanta had known as a girl. The silence between them was comfortable, filled only with the sound of their breathing and the distant cry of a hawk. Then a scent caught on the wind. It was the smell of wood smoke, not from a shepherd's camp, but from the hearths of a village, carrying with it the faint, almost imperceptible aroma of baking bread. It was a human smell, a civilized smell. For Atalanta, the scent was a key turning in a lock deep within her mind. The ghost of a memory surfaced, vivid and painful. Ilara, her foster mother, pulling a loaf from the hearth, her face kind and flushed with heat. The memory was accompanied by a feeling of safety, of belonging, of a roof and four walls. A tear, a human tear from a consciousness long submerged, welled in the lioness's eye and traced a damp path through the fur of her cheek. A low, rumbling sound came from Hippomenes. It was not a growl of warning, but a groan of recognition. He was staring at a particular configuration of stars that had just begun to glimmer in the twilight sky. The constellation of the Great Bear. And with that sight came a flood of his own, the feel of a ship's deck beneath his feet, the salt spray on his face, the weight of a golden apple in his palm, the sight of Atalanta at the starting line, her body poised like a drawn arrow. He remembered the love, not us a beast loves its mate, but us a man loves a woman, a complex, chosen, cherished thing. Their eyes met, and for the first time in years, it was not just the recognition of two bonded animals. It was a meeting of souls. The human intelligence, long buried under the curse, flickered to the surface, clear and agonizing. They solaloied each other, truly solaloied each other. Atalanta let out a soft whimper, a sound that held all the grief of her lost life. She padded slowly to him and pressed her head against his broad, aged neck. He rumbled a deep, sorrowful purr, nuzzling her with a tenderness that transcended instinct. They were together, us they had been in the beginning and would be until the end. But the curse had given them this one final cruelty, the return of their memories, just in time to feel the full weight of their loss. They did not hunt that night. They stayed on the rock, watching the stars emerge, two old souls trapped in dying beasts, silently sharing a lifetime of regrets and a love that even the gods' wrath could not completely extinguish. The roaming curse was nearing its end, not with a roar, but with a shared, silent lament for the people they had once been. The legacy unbound. The end, when it came, was not dramatic. There was no final heroic hunt, no confrontation with hunters or gods. One morning, as a hard frost glittered on the moss and the first light of dawn tinged the eastern sky, Hippomenes did not rise from where he slept beside Atalanta. His great heart, which had beaten for her in two forms, had simply stopped in the night. The lion was gone. The prince was finally free. Atalanta the lioness nuzzled his still form, a low, continuous moan of grief vibrating in her chest. The bond, the curse-forged tether that had connected them for so long, had been severed. The part of her that was still the beast understood loss. The part of her that was remembering the woman understood death. She stayed by his side for a day and a night, a silent, grieving sentinel. As the second dawn broke, she knew it was time. With a last, lingering look at the only companion she had known in her long exile, she turned and walked away, her steps slow and heavy with a weariness that was more than physical. She did not look back. She wandered for days, driven by a final, residual instinct, until she found herself at the entrance of a deep, dry cave, a place not unlike the bear's den of her infancy. It was a place to be alone. She crawled inside, the darkness a welcome shroud. The last of her strength ebbed away. Curling into a tight circle, she laid her head upon her paws. The images of her life did not flash before her eyes. They settled over her like a soft snowfall. The she-bear's warmth, the feel of a bowstring, the salt spray of the Argo, the golden glow of the apples, the love in Hippomenes' human eyes. Her last breath was a soft sigh, a release of air that carried with it the spirit of the swift-footed huntress, finally, mercifully unbound from the beast. The lioness was no more. But Atalanta was. In the world of men, her story was already being woven into the immutable fabric of myth. She became a symbol, her meaning shifting depending on who was telling the tale. To the fathers and kings, she was a cautionary figure, a warning against willful women who defied the natural order, whose unchecked independence led only to tragedy. Her end, in the form of a beast, was seen as a fitting punishment for a life lived too wildly. But to others, to the young, to the dreamers, to the girls who felt the stir of something restless in their own hearts, she was something else entirely. She was a beacon. Atalanta was the girl who said no, the woman who demanded that her worth be measured by her skill, not her womb, the heroine who stood shoulder to shoulder with the greatest names of Greece and earned her place not by birthright, but by sheer, uncompromising excellence. Her vow to Artemis was not seen as a rejection of life, but as a consecration of self. The story of the foot race, in particular, captured the imagination. It was a tale of agency. She was not a passive prize. She was the active arbiter of her own fate, setting the terms of the contest and enforcing its deadly price. Even her eventual loss to Hippomenes was not a simple defeat. It was a choice, a moment where desire triumphed over dogma, a human complexity that made her more relatable, not less. Her legacy was not a single thing, but a duality, much like the goddesses who shaped her life. From Artemis, she drew the power of the untamed, the self-sufficient, the fiercely independent. From Aphrodite, in the end, she learned the power of connection, the vulnerability and strength found in chosen love. Her tragedy was not that she loved, but that the gods, in their capriciousness, punished the expression of that love. She became a legend of potential, a proof that a woman could be more than a daughter, a wife, a mother, that she could be a hunter, an athlete, a hero, a sovereign of her own destiny. Her story was told to daughters by mothers who secretly wished for them a world with fewer constraints. It was a story that whispered, even in the face of overwhelming tradition, that it was possible to run your own race. The lions were never seen again. They passed into the realm of story, a poignant postscript to a monumental life. But Atalanta, the woman, endured. Her name was spoken with awe for centuries, a testament to a spirit so vibrant, so unapologetically itself, that not even divine punishment could erase it from the memory of the world. She was the swift-footed, the unwavering, the balanced. She was Atalanta, and her race, against the expectations of the world, was one she ultimately won. The eternal echo. The physical forms of the lions returned to the earth, their bones bleaching in the sun before being covered by layers of fallen leaves and the slow, patient soil of the mountain. The curse was lifted, their spirits released from the prison of flesh to wander the misty plains of the underworld, or perhaps to find a truer rest. But the story of Atalanta, as the way with all great myths, refused to be buried. It took root in the collective soul of humanity, growing and evolving, its meaning shifting with the tides of history, its echoes reverberating long after the fall of the very gods who had shaped her destiny. In the grand symposiums of classical Athens, philosophers debated her. To some, she was an allegory for the conflict between physis, nature, and nomos, law. Her wild upbringing represented the raw, untamed state of humanity, while her integration into society and subsequent punishment illustrated the perils and necessities of civilizing laws and the dangers of reverting to a bestial state. Her foot race was a metaphor for the human condition itself, a desperate sprint toward a desired goal, tripped up by golden distractions of earthly desire. Centuries later, in the vaulted libraries of Rome, poets like Ovid immortalized her in verse, smoothing the rough-hewn edges of the Greek tale into a more polished, though no less tragic, narrative. Her transformation was rendered with a pathos that highlighted the capricious cruelty of the gods, making her a figure to be pitied as much as admired. Her story became a staple of art and mosaic, a recognizable icon of a beautiful, powerful woman brought low by passion, a theme that resonated deeply with the Roman sensibilities of order and the tragic flaws that shattered it. When the world turned Christian, the interpreters of myth saw in Atalanta a different kind of lesson. The Church Fathers sometimes pointed to her as a pagan prefiguration of the dangers of pagan idolatry and unchecked feminine power. Her devotion to Artemis was misdirected faith, her physical prowess an unnatural inversion of God's order. Yet, in secret, in the hearts of women praying in cold stone chapels, she remained something else, a secret sister. A reminder that strength and speed were not sins, that the desire for a life beyond the spindle in the nursery was a holy fire, not a demonic one. The Renaissance rediscovered her with a feverish intensity. Artists, intoxicated by the rediscovery of classical forms and humanist ideals, saw in Atalanta the perfect fusion of physical beauty and heroic virtue. She was painted and sculpted repeatedly, a lithe, muscular figure, often mid-stride, her face a blend of determination and divine grace. She represented the Renaissance ideal of virtue, human excellence, action, and prowess. The golden apples in these depictions were not merely plot devices. They were symbols of the temptations of the material world that could divert even the most focused soul from its path of glory. A lysosome the Age of Enlightenment dawned, her myth was scrutinized through the lens of reason. She became a subject for essays on the rights of women. Writers, both male and female, used her story to argue for female education and autonomy. Her intelligent counsel on the Argo, her strategic mind in the hunt, and her fierce defense of her own sovereignty were held up as proof that women were not intellectually or morally inferior, but were systematically denied the opportunity to prove their worth. Atalanta became a proto-feminist icon, her foot race a powerful allegory for a woman's right to set the terms of her own sovereignty. Life. In the modern world, her echo has not faded, it has multiplied. She is a fixture in fantasy novels and comic books, her name a byword for agility and fierce independence. She is analyzed by psychologists as a case study in nature versus nurture, her feral childhood a extreme example of environmental influence. On the running tracks of the world, young athletes, sometimes without even knowing the full breadth of her tale, feel a kinship with her. The pure, burning focus of a sprinter leaving the blocks, the solitary endurance of a long-distance runner, these are the secular prayers offered at the altar of her memory. Her legacy is a living, breathing thing. It is found in the determination of every girl who picks up a sport deemed for boys, in the resolve of every woman who negotiates for her worth in a boardroom or a workshop, in the quiet strength of every person who chooses a path of self-defined purpose over societal expectation. She is the eternal what if. What if a woman were free to be the hero of her own story? What if her body was celebrated for its strength, not just its beauty? What if love was a choice, not a command? The story of Atalanta is no longer just a Greek myth. It is a fundamental strand in the DNA of our understanding of human potential. It is a story about the cost of freedom and the price of passion, about the wildness in the human spirit that civilization can never fully extinguish. The stadium in Tegea is dust. The Argo is a memory of timber and song. But the echo of her footfalls on the earth, the whisper of the arrow she loosed, the defiant no she spoke to a world that sought to confine her, these sounds are eternal. They are a promise, passed down through the ages, that the race is not always to the strong, nor the battle to the powerful, but to those who, like Atalanta, have the courage to run their own course, unwavering and balanced to the very end.